Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Created a Hero Revolution Without Quirks? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Everything started with a notebook. Well, 3 notebooks. 3 notebooks and a drawer that needed a key. Izuku didn't often think about these notebooks, except when they were all he thought about, only unlocking them and adding a page here or there when it was truly necessary. For one of the notebooks, it had been necessary quite a bit lately, and the others were being dragged along for the ride. This wasn't a problem, exactly, except that the lock was no longer strong enough to hold them. Not when Izuku needed to make a decision. Izuku didn't want to make a decision, not really, not when making a decision meant actually trying to control the whirlwinds of ideas and thoughts and emotions that spun in his mind. He was much better at controlling the mutter storm with Aizawa-sensei's training, but his mentor never judged when Izuku just had so many thoughts that they just needed out. Izuku couldn't disappoint Aizawa-sensei. He wouldn't. If the man needed a decision, then Izuku would decide. He'd decide, even if it meant dealing with the notebooks in the drawer, the thoughts that needed out of his head, yet couldn't be spoken and maybe shouldn't be free. They'd been on a roof. The evening Aizawa brought Kaken up in conversation. Not the school roof, never the school roof, but the roof with the overgrown garden where Izuku had left Eraserhead's first present. Izuku had his back to the tree, rough bark pressing a reminder that he was really Eraserhead's intern into his spine, as both of them drank juice pouches after a lesson about patrol routes. Eraserhead's gaze had felt like a blanket, heavy and comforting, but also limiting maneuverability as it twined about limbs. Izuku had known that he wouldn't like what the man had to say, but didn't expect his breath to freeze when the hero had sighed and finally spoken. "We need to talk about the burns." "What burns?" Izuku asked, momentarily unable to tell if his response had been reflexive or genuine confusion. He'd already been pretty good at avoiding Kaken before Eraserhead's training, almost a month in, and he was downright excellent. Izuku didn't think he'd had any burns since the thing with the essay, when the very observant Eraserhead had caught him on a roof. Izuku opened his mouth again only to close it with a clack when Eraserhead turned red eyes on him. "Kid, I swear if you say, it's fine, I will make you do laps until you collapse." This was not an idle threat. Aizawa-sensei had decided that the best way to start handling Izuku's confidence issues was to make sure Izuku wasn't at least perpetuating negative self-image out loud, also therapy, but the hero was still letting Izuku pretend he didn't see that coming. There had been a lot of jumping jacks in the beginning of training. Eraserhead sighed again, running a hand through messy hair. "I know you're schooling Esikis and there are many people who make it worse, but I also know that it's Bakugo who's the worst, who's the one responsible for the burns. I know he was your childhood friend, I know no one tried to stop him, but what I don't know is what you want to do about it." Izuku squeaked, then successfully got out, "What I want to do about it?" "Yes." Shoyuta crossed his arms and tilted his head just a bit, clearly being careful not to display much emotion. "Look, kid, I know you're smart. I know you have plans. I know you can handle things, even if for some reason you haven't. I'm worried that reason is that you don't think anyone will believe you, which I would have hoped you know isn't the case anymore." Izuku shot to his feet so quickly he stumbled. The idea that Aizawa-sensei thought Izuku didn't appreciate his teacher, didn't understand just how much the hero had done, poured like lead through his bones. "That's not dash. Easy, kid." Eraserhead placed one warm hand on Izuku's shoulder and pressed him back toward the tree with infinite gentleness. With a shaky breath rattling around in his lungs, Izuku opened his eyes and met the stare of his teacher. "Kaken's going to be a great hero." "No, he's not." Izuku blinked. "And he's certainly not getting into UA. Don't look at me like that. He's not the kind of student I want in my class or Nizu wants in his school." But Izuku's mouth tasted like cotton. He had words, somewhere, bound in paper and locked in a drawer by trembling hands with a key that burned across his collarbones. Aizawa-sensei collapsed into a cross-legged position. "Heroes aren't bullies, Izuku. Not the good ones. Not the ones like you already are and I train my students to be." Izuku said nothing, just stared and hoped Aizawa-sensei understood what Izuku was trying to say. He wasn't sure why he hoped that, since Izuku himself wasn't sure what he was trying to say. Something must have gotten through, because Aizawa-sensei lifted an arm and placed his palm on Izuku's curls. You don't need to explain now. Or at all if that's what you want. But I do need a decision. Me? Yes. If I was making the decision, Bakugo would be charged with assault, at the very least, and possibly sent to juvie. Izuku didn't know what his face did, but he knew it was stiff, and apparently the expected response, since Aizawa-sensei gave a chuckle that sounded like tumbling stones. Yeah, I didn't think you'd like that. Aizawa-sensei stood, extending a hand that Izuku automatically accepted to help the boy up. You have a weak, problem child to think about it. And not making a decision still counts as a decision. If you want me, or Tsukachi, or your mom to decide, that's fine. That's completely okay, and we'll all still be both proud and fond of you. They stopped under a ledge that provided protection from the starting rain, and the flickering light over the stairs cast shadows over Eraserhead's face. I want you to ask yourself, though, whether one day, if Bakugo does become a hero, would you trust him to save you? To save your mom? Or looking at it a different way, is there anyone you know right now whom you wouldn't trust him to save? Izuku walked home with the voices of his quirkless support group echoing with each raindrop. His group that supported each other in their quirklessness, supported him in his desire to be a hero, supported the other society cast-offs in their ever-expanding information network, his group that Izuku wouldn't let Kaken near with a 10-foot pole and a barricade of steel. It was his group that made the decision difficult on multiple levels. If there had been only 2 notebooks, then Izuku could have decided more easily. Not easily, because Kaken was his childhood friend and there were ribbons and threads and spools of emotions knotted in his chest all tied to the other boy, but more easily. He could have trusted, he had adults he trusted, the decision to Eraserhead or his mother. But the group, as much as they were people and individuals that Izuku wasn't sure Kaken would save, not in a way that mattered, were also his network. The bones of his network. And because of them, Kaken also had an entry in the 3rd notebook. The first notebook was for Kaken, never brought to school and not just about his quirk, a potential decision all in its own if Izuku decided to never be bothered by the boy again, decided to hurt instead of help. The second one was for endeavor. Bakugo could become a hero like him, and Izuku hated to imagine a world where Kaken would be fine with that. The third one was one of his villain notebooks. Sort of. It held multiple people and multiple entries. The third one was filled with criminals, which Izuku was beginning to understand weren't exactly the same thing as villains. The thing was that not all of his group were law-abiding civilians. Most tried to be, sure, but technically loitering was against the law, even though there wasn't much else to do when you were homeless and just needed an hour of sleep. Stealing was illegal, but when it made the difference between a gaunt-faced child, well, decisions were made. The other thing, the mostly though not entirely accidental thing, was that the group and the network were no longer entirely the same entity. Part of this was simply because not everyone in the group contributed to the same level. Which was fine, excellent even, because Izuku would never force anyone, particularly a quirkless someone so used to force, into something they didn't want to do. So some participants just shared their own stories. Some passed along gossip. Some talked about injustices their families and friends faced. Some sought out problems and talked to people and then brought their findings to Izuku. They did whatever they were comfortable with and knew that was okay. Their comfort levels had grown as Izuku succeeded, as he came back with newspaper articles and arrest records and his first paycheck clenched in hands that shook as he whispered of Eraserhead, internship, and shadowed eyes. That actually saw potential in a quirkless boy's thin limbs. It had taken weeks, still, before Izuku recognized that increase in comfort, till he realized that he might have adults he trusted, but he also had adults who trusted him, and that, well, maybe he was the hero Aizawa-sensei said he was. As their comfort level and Izuku's skills had grown, so too had the network. Izuku didn't just hear about Yuri's career job, but accompanied the man as a pretend apprentice and learnt the seedier sides of the city. He realized that Yuri's sick mother and Murata's grandmother are in the same care center, So connected the two so they weren't lonely and was invited to the tea they started with several other highly knowledgeable elders. He learned that Shin with the quiet voice who talked about his nieces and nephews as if they were his own, worked at an antique shop that dealt in stolen material. Material that Izuku was reasonably sure was provided by Shin's brother. Izuku didn't turn either of them in to the police. He didn't have proof. He deliberately didn't have proof, even as Shin brought Izuku information on the occasional pawnbroker that fleeced their desperate clients or thefts that had gone horribly, bloodily wrong. What Izuku did have was the blinding smiles of two tiny children in clothes worn and large on thin frames, ridiculously happy to let Izuku read them a story in the library before their uncle took them home to a one-bedroom apartment next to train tracks that roared all night. This was the third notebook. This was the third heavily coded notebook that only involved names Izuku had made up, his own hero-villain names, because these people could be either. They could be. Except society had failed them. These people committed crimes, did bad things, sometimes not even for the right reasons, or well, reasons that Izuku could understand, could justify, but they did it because there weren't many, sometimes any, other choices. He wasn't legitimizing crime, Izuku didn't think. He still believed in heroes and villains. He got it. He understood how being told your one, useless thing over and over and over made it true. Or true enough to invade your every moment and make movement, forward, backwards, sideways, any movement at all, paralyzing. He understood how it never ended up being simply what you were told, but also what you were shown and what your experience amounted to being. Kaken wasn't in this third notebook at first, because Kaken wasn't a villain or a criminal. Izuku didn't give Kaken an entry in this third notebook until it was 3/4 full. Full of people his network had shown him, sometimes inadvertently. Full of backstories that would never be in the media, but that made so much sense once Izuku had done some digging. Full of vigilantes that had chips on their shoulders and reasons Izuku might sort of agree with, in certain lights. Kaken's entry was after another a teen who'd been telling Izuku about a murder, because even if the police were looking for a murderer of homeless children, and this teen didn't think they were, and even if the police took this teen and his scruffy clothes and stapled skin seriously, he couldn't risk being sent home. So when a senior on the streets, a tired older man who came to group with a beaming smile about once every month or two, suggested talking to Deku, this kid who knew things, the teen had figured, what the hell? He could outrun a quirkless kid, surely. Izuku had learned a lot about victimology for this case and found 7 other victims from the teen's description of the crime. Tsukachi and Eraserhead had put the killer away rather decisively. Izuku went back. The teen had ghosts in his glare and hunger in his cheeks and a young girl hiding in his shadow. It was weeks later, after 22 sets of steamed buns eaten in an alley, that Dabi rested a shaking hand on the napping Toga's blonde hair and told Izuku about quirk marriages and younger siblings and hero training that no one would believe. Izuku wrote Dabi's entry that night and Kaken's the next morning. They weren't the same. Kaken had gone through none of what the older teen had. But Izuku had started thinking about the hero system again. About training and regulations and the time before schools. Dabi hadn't been given a choice whether he wanted to be hero, though he had. Izuku recognized the grief of a shattered dream, and trained rigorously for that fate. Kaken had a choice, yes, but what kind of choice was it when everyone saw his quirk, saw a child's, a toddler's, enthusiasm and said yes, you will be a hero, over and over and over again made things true. No one had ever told Kaken no. They'd never taught him right from wrong beyond the dichotomies of heroes versus villains, good versus evil, and powerful versus weak. Yes, Kaken should have picked up some basic social skills and been able to figure out that some things weren't okay on his own, but that didn't change the fact that no one had ever taught him his actions weren't okay, weren't heroic. His parents were good people, but completely oblivious to the way the rest of their family piled expectation upon goal upon praise for their son in attempt to SCK up to the future hero and gain bragging rights for the rest of their lives. Dabi talked about his father, and Izuku had thoughts about this unidentified father, the kind he figured might belong under lock and key, in fits and starts, and Izuku didn't have to wonder how society could produce a hero that corrupted by power and might and certainty. Izuku was watching it happen before his very eyes. that was Izuku's childhood friend they were ruining. So Izuku sat in front of 3 unopened notebooks, hands tracing over thin paper covers in unsteady, shaking movements. 1 notebook for a person he loved and hated, 1 notebook for a hero that wasn't, and 1 notebook for the people that society had failed. That weren't villains yet. Aizawa had wanted to know what Izuku wanted to do with Kaken. Kaken, who was wrong and had hurt Izuku and might hurt Izuku's group or network, Izuku's people. Kaken, who could end up in all 3 notebooks if he continued down such a similar path to endeavor. Izuku stood up, palms flat on his desk hard enough to still them, with his back hunched and eyed closed. He knew what he wanted to do with Kaken, what he'd wanted to do with Kaken since the first time he'd fallen in the creek. What he wanted to do with everyone in that 3rd notebook. Izuku placed Endeavor's book in the drawer, then threw Kaken's on top of it. Neither were relevant to his decision. His hands were steady after the click of the key in the drawer, and as he tucked his 3rd notebook carefully into his backpack, followed by 2 blank notebooks, with cats on them. Aizawa-sensei had bought him notebooks, a new box of pens, and his coat. He plotted train schedules in his mind as he locked the door and texted Aizawa-sensei to meet him at UA in a couple of hours. Izuku hadn't actually been to the school yet, but it wasn't like he didn't know the way. Kaken had hurt Izuku. Badly. Hero Society had hurt Kaken. Insidiously. If the problem wasn't just with Kaken, then the decision couldn't be either. Aizawa-sensei wouldn't accept that answer alone, not after seeing the burns, not if Izuku wasn't 100% sure that he wasn't doing this to avoid the issue. If the problem was with Hero Society and Hero Education, then, well, Izuku supposed it was about time he got to know his grand-sensei in person. Izuku was going to help them. He was a hero and he wasn't alone. Everything escalated with a presentation. Izuku watched Aizawa-sensei look down at the 30-page document in front of him. Aizawa then looked up at the chart paper pinned to 3 separate walls and scattered on the floor of Nizu's office and across to the slideshow presentation currently stuck on an animatic of a small rodent-like creature popping out of a box while saying thank you on a 30-second loop. Next, Aizawa-sensei tilted his head and looked at Nizu, clearly taking in the slightly manic gleam to his eye and the animalistic flair to his grin. Izuku's grand-sensei had dropped certain aspects of his genial attitude somewhere in hour 3, after the first 2 cackles hadn't made Izuku bat an eye. In fact, Izuku rather felt like he'd passed one of the most important tests of his life with honors and hugs. Aizawa then tilted his entire body to look at Izuku, taking in the wide eyes and the fine trembles and spasms that racked Izuku's fingers. The tremble had started somewhere near the end of hour 4, from nerves or exhaustion or clenching his pens too hard. "I'm sorry, you've been here how long?" Aizawa asked. 6 hours. Nizu crowed. "Right. Your delay because of that last-minute mugging was really quite helpful, Aizawa-sensei." Izuku bit his lip, but couldn't stop himself from continuing. The extra hour allowed us to focus in on curriculum and tie it to the particular challenges of age range and inconsistent education. Izuku trailed off as Shoyuta stood and approached with quiet steps. "This was not what I meant when I asked for a decision. I know. I just kept coming back to, and it wasn't not Kaken's fault. I'm not trying to get him out of taking responsibility, rather the opposite, I think, but society played a role too. And I can't fix society just like that, but I could fix a part of it? Maybe think." He cut off this time with wide eyes when Aizawa-sensei placed both hands on Izuku's slightly hunched shoulders. "Problem child. I am so effing proud of you." Aizawa-sensei had braced himself before he spoke, so didn't falter an inch when Izuku gave into the crying and octopus arms. Izuku just got very gentle hands in his hair and tracing over his back, and he was just going to stay here forever, please and thank you. A conversation went on over his head, though it was completely silent, so Izuku probably would have been at a loss even if he'd left his hug, but eventually Aizawa-sensei stepped back. "Please, I'm taking you home. You have the day off school tomorrow so you can sleep in." Izuku rubbed his eyes. "Tomorrow's Wednesday? I don't have the day off school. I cleared it with your mom already. Plan homeschool is set, particularly now that you've met Nizu. Problem child, it's 11:30 at night. I'm taking you home and you get to sleep in as your reward for being an overachieving chaos gremlin." I'll bring you back to UA in the afternoon where Nizu will go over the plan to get you through early graduation and you can spend the rest of the year with us. Izuku blinked at his teacher, wondering if he should ask one of the many questions floating in his brain. He glanced at the very toothy grin of his grand-sensei and decided that no, it wasn't worth it tonight. Izuku maybe trusted them. Nizu had listened, helped, and made his idea real, and Aizawa-sensei was proud, and Izuku was exhausted. He just hadn't realized how much until Aizawa-sensei pointed out the time. "K." Aizawa-sensei snorted, but turned around and crouched. "Hop on, kid, I don't think you're going to even make it to the car." Izuku could. He absolutely could. He'd made it farther with dragging feet and drooping arms with less incentive. But he gave a little bow to Nizu, who glowed at him, and climbed on, burying his face in surprisingly soft hair and wrapped his arms loosely around Aizawa-sensei's neck. He didn't think he'd remember the trip back home, but he'd never forget the sound of breaths and heartbeats whispering in his ear. Izuku and Aizawa-sensei waked down the street in silence. The older man was happily sipping the coffee Izuku's mom had poured into a cat-themed travel mug as she ushered them both out of the apartment. Izuku was eating a muffin, trying not to sigh in happiness at every chocolate chip he found. The silence was nice. Izuku loved to talk, couldn't always help the words that babbled forth when he had an idea he was working through, but he also loved the quiet. Well, the quiet that wasn't awkward or forced or laden with traps that he was terrified of springing. There were never traps in Aizawa-sensei's silences. Aizawa-sensei's silences were blankets of calm possibilities laced with trust. Aizawa-sensei was the first to break today's silence, with a sideways look over his coffee and smirk at Izuku's tired eyes. "Recovered from Nizu's exam hell yet?" Izuku scowled for all of 20 seconds, before he felt himself smiling. His grand-sensei was mean but in the best, most challenging of ways. The last month could very adequately be described as exam hell, but Izuku had done it. He'd succeeded. The graduation party his mom had thrown with Aizawa-sensei, Nizu-sensei, and Tsukachi had been one of the best nights of Izuku's life. He'd never had so many people proud of him before. Knowing this was perfectly visible on his face, and that the smile was preferable to the tears he could feel welling up at the memory, Izuku turned from his teacher to scan the streets, still busy with the last vestiges of the morning rush. "Are you going to tell me where we're going yet?" Aizawa-sensei lifted a brow. "And ruin your surprise reward?" "Feel free to guess, though." Izuku glanced up from under his bangs and hummed. "If you wanted to hear any of my many ideas, I would have needed 2 hours of extra sleep." The older hero snorted, reaching out to ruffle Izuku's curls. "Cheeky. That might work if you didn't regularly text Tsukachi and I at midnight, kid." "Those were accidents." As in he'd accidentally lost track of time and then accidentally texted them without checking said time because rabbit holes were dangerous things. "Sure." Aizawa-sensei's smile slid into a sigh. "And we're here." Izuku wanted to whip around and study his surroundings to see what he'd missed, because he had ideas and guesses and thoughts but none of them seemed right. Instead, he turned sparking green eyes to his mentor. "Are you okay?" You sighed. "Is this a bad surprise? Or something you don't want to do? Or don't think I'm ready for? Because I trust you, I do, and if you're not happy or don't think I'm ready or something is upsetting dash." Izuku was cut off by the weight of a calloused hand settling and resting on his curls. "Breathe, problem child." His hand carded through Izuku's hair to rest at the base of his skull. "You're fine." That was an "I'm too tired to deal with this energy" sigh. "It's a very good surprise, and not just for you." Izuku blinked, even as he leaned into the weight of the hand. Eraserhead had originally been a little wary of all the hugs that were an important method of Midoriya appreciation. He'd responded very well to Izuku and his mother's war of attrition, however, which translated into a lot of proud head pats that were maybe Izuku's second favorite thing ever, after his mother's hugs, naturally. "I'm not high energy right now." Izuku knew he could be, but he hadn't been lying. 2 hours more sleep would have been amazing. Aizawa-sensei opened his mouth but was cut off by a loud yell. "Shoulda." Aizawa sighed again, turning around with red eyes to glare at a tall blonde man with long braided hair and bright sunglasses. The man smiled a little sheepishly, but bounded over with all the enthusiasm of a retriever puppy. They exchanged some kind of greeting, but Izuku wasn't really paying attention. Well, he was, because observation was one of his greatest strengths, and Aizawa-sensei would find something far worse than laps for Izuku to do if he ever did something as foolish as zone completely out, but his awareness was down to maybe 30%. The rest was on this man, who was fairly familiar. There was something about his face and that shout. He was clearly close with Aizawa-sensei, which made him likely either a hero or hero-adjacent, and that meant that the man probably looked rather different than normal. Izuku should still be able to tell who this was. The strange man got a light slap up the head for all his fuss. Yamada! We're not alone, you buffoon. Calm down and say hello to your surprise. The one that I took a full day off for? But Yamada obligingly tuned to Izuku, one arm still clutching Aizawa-sensei's, and then promptly froze. Hey Sho. He used fingers with black painted nails to tug on Aizawa-sensei's sleeve. Is that him? Are you finally letting me meet your little listener? Oh. Both men turned to Izuku. Your present mic. The braids really threw me. Izuku blinked, once, as his own words hit him. Oh gosh, sheet. Your present mic. I have so many questions. Like frequency. And directionality. And sounds in general? Does your quirk work with whistles and hums or only words? Not that words aren't great, or that you aren't great with them. Your radio show is amazing. So are the helplines. And the hybrid model of agency radio station and oops. Nice to meet you. Aizawa-sensei was laughing at him. Not out loud but in his eyes. Izuku narrowed his own, taking in present mix growing delight and Aizawa's growing smirk. And also the way the neither of them seemed to be inclined to move from the hold present mic had settled into with an arm hooked around Aizawa-sensei's elbow. You're best friends with present mic. And didn't tell me. Present mic laughed. And midnight, the three of us went to UA together. Close your mouth, problem child. Izuku only complied so he could scowl. You're going to send the day with Yamada. I thought you'd be pleased to get to talk to another hero. I am. Izuku asked at a volume high enough to make himself blush red as he realized the force of his own words. Present Mike laughed again, bright and sincerely happy in a way that Izuku wasn't used to happening. Around him. I can do that. I've been offering to do that for literal months. But I find I'm suspicious, since I wasn't told anything ahead of time. Months? I've been Aizawa-sensei's intern for just over a month. But he's been talking about you for much longer, little listener. And I know Tsukachi's significantly ahead of me in achieving favored uncle status. Izuku stared before flailing at a realization. Wait, yes. I agree this is very suspicious. They both turned to stare at a very unrepentant Aizawa as Izuku continued. He told me this was a reward for graduating and possibly something I did with Nizu-sensei, but he's given me no other information and the timing and urgency with which we left my apartment was unusual. I agree with your little listener, Sho. Present Mike was nodding so hard his braids went swinging. This smells like a plot. Aizawa sighed, going to drink from his coffee before giving the empty mug an expression of betrayal. Yes, fine, it's a plot. But I have Nizu's and Tsukachi's willing participation. He spoke over Izuku's attempted interjection, and Inko's full support. So just trust me and take the distraction that will make you both happy? Present Mick's eyes narrowed at his friend, clearly putting several things together. At Shuda's nod the man's eyes widened and he turned back to Izuku. How would you like a tour of the station? So very much. Which was very true, even if this was still suspicious. They promptly turned their backs on Aizawa and started to walk away. I need him back by 2:30 p.m. Yeah. Yamada waved without turning around, but Izuku ran back and threw his arms around Aizawa's waist. Aizawa barely had time to run both palms through green curls before Izuku had raced back to Yamada's, present Mick's, side. They walked along in the sunshine for a moment or two before Izuku stopped studying the tall man's impish smile. So, Yamada said as he clapped his hands together. Izuku looked up a little tentatively, biting back on the nerves struggling in his stomach with each step further from his mentor, But this was Aizawa-sensei's best friend, someone Aizawa-sensei had let hang off him and smiled at in way Izuku had only seen directed at himself and Inko. How do you feel about a little passive-aggressive, harmless revenge for secret keeping? Izuku tilted his head and considered his shoes, considered the many bullies that had lost their homework, their wallets, or their dignity by way of something that couldn't be linked in any way to Izuku. Positively. Yamada cackles. Excellent. I'm thinking tour and then lunch with Namuri, that's midnight. She's also been dying to meet her little nephew and has been begrudgingly kept at bay by Mr. Grumpy Pants. Izuku didn't know whether to laugh at the description of his mentor or blush at the description of being a nephew. Okay, Izuku said softly, feeling the slight trembles of his hands buried in his pockets start to steady at Yamada's beaming grin. You could also show me some of your cases if you want. I mean, I'm not saying that you need me to solve them or anything because obviously you're a pro and Aizawa-sensei's still training me, but, I could use it later? Like when he's giving me an exercise I can say I need to help you with something because I promised and he doesn't want to disappoint his friend. Or something. There was a long pause where Izuku started counting weeds and got up to 9, before a solid, warm arm was slung around his shoulders, telegraphed, easy to dodge if Izuku wanted, and he found he didn't. I like the way you think. Izuku loved Yamada. He'd already been pretty mad fond of Present Mike. Izuku hadn't been kidding earlier. The man's combined radio show agency helpline center was brilliant in the most practical of ways. The man himself, however, was electric and kind and wickedly smart. Izuku could see how he complimented the skulking and kind and deviously smart Aizawa, could see how Yamada lit up at anything to do with Aizawa, and just how many of Aizawa's stories made sense now that Izuku could see this face and this name as part of them. Yamada didn't just welcome Izuku's questions, he matched them. He threw out question after question about Izuku and seemed to dance around anything sensitive or painful with an ease that Izuku envied. Also, he didn't limit the questions to details about Izuku. He wanted Izuku's opinions. Yamada clearly knew that Izuku was quirkless, and clearly didn't give a flying fig, but he wanted to know what Izuku thought about Quirkism, villainous quirks, hero fights, damage procedures, civilian evacuations, and anything else that bounced through the man's mind. Even better, Izuku didn't always have opinions. Yamada threw out concepts and procedures and ideas that Izuku had never even thought of before. And he didn't care that Izuku hadn't thought of them before. Each answer Izuku gave seemed to delight the man while each look of puzzlement Izuku wore seemed to thrill him. Once, about a 20 minutes walk from the park where they'd left Aizawa, Izuku had responded to a question about hospitals, medical centers, walk-in clinics, and agency responsibility by stopping in his tracks, falling into full mutterstorm, and digging into his backpack to grab a notebook and write a full page of notes in shorthand. He'd frozen an inch from the bottom, slowly looking up from his page with creaking muscles. Yamada had grinned at him, provided 3 names that Izuku might want to research later, and asked to borrow a piece of paper. His smile hadn't faltered as Izuku had returned to his backpack to pull out a smaller notebook with many missing pages. He didn't tear his analysis notebooks for anything, occasionally copying parts out by hand or making use of his mom's access to library photocopiers. Yamada had pulled a thin marker out of one of his jacket's many pockets, accepted the paper, and then made several notes about one of Izuku's questions. He'd explained, absently, that he actually didn't know much about how evacuation procedures were standardized in other industries, having scrapped his radio station's procedures in a fit of disgust and rebuilt it step by step with his agency partners and Aizawa over too many pizzas. He wrote a couple notes and slipped the scrap of paper in a BRC pocket with a wink and a promise to ask a few contacts and get back to Izuku. He was going to get back to him. Izuku may have been in a bit of a daze by the time they actually made it to the station. That hadn't stopped him from taking in the building and its people and its security measures with wide eyes. They toured the radio station side of things more than the agency, because as much as Present Mike was high up in his agency, he really couldn't take an unknown kid past several security checkpoints with no warning. Izuku really didn't care, though. It was fascinating to see how the different radio offices were set up and the care that was put into designing new segments and the research that was done before anything made it on air. And then there were the call centers. Izuku had listened to Put Your Hands Up radio many times, though never actually had the courage to call in. He had, however, called in once or twice, or thrice, to one of the support lines that Present Mike had promoted on the show. It had taken several promotions for Izuku to consider calling the helplines. Several particularly bad beatings, burns arcing across his skin and throbbing with a message he didn't want to hear, and he'd actually called. The operator had been kind and unobtrusive, and once she ascertained that there was no immediate danger, she had simply listened. Izuku had never said he was quirkless, he was desperate not stupid, but he'd cited quirkism and babbled his thoughts to a stranger. He hadn't called much after starting his group, but the calls had been help at a time when no one other than his mom would even consider helping him. Maybe, someday, he'd tell Yamada that. Seeing the call center from this side of things was powerful, and seeing the training the operators were put through was comforting. He adored the tour and adored Yamada. He'd been introduced as Yamada's nephew twice, banged into 3 doorways with his wild gestures, and had met 5 heroes. He was happy, which was why Yamada's current frown sent cold eddies down his veins and trembles into his fingers. This might be where Izuku screwed up, where this ridiculous string of happiness frayed and unraveled and was never meant to be his in the first place. Izuku couldn't figure out where or when exactly the frown had appeared, which made finding and fixing his blunder very difficult. He'd been too caught up in the call center and his group. Yamada had asked about the quirkless. Asked about what the station and center could do to provide more resources and help. Had said that he wasn't putting this on Izuku at all, but if Izuku had any ideas, he'd love to hear them. And Izuku had ideas. His talk had slipped past Mutterstorm and into babbling as Izuku discussed his quirkless support group and the other anti-bullying library groups and the trends he'd noticed among the library patrons and community. Yamada had looked impressed at first, Izuku was pretty sure. So the frown was terrifying. His words dried up, clogging his thought and rattling his fingers. Present Mike took a moment to notice, meaning that they continued down the fluorescent-lit corridor for silence past 3 doors before Izuku found the breath to force out a breathy, "Sorry." Present Mike stopped short, whipping his head to look at Izuku. For what, little listener? Izuku didn't really know. For ruining everything? Somehow? You're frowning. What? Oh no, that's not your fault. Yamada reached out a calloused palm, pausing slightly at Izuku's tiny flinch. When Izuku didn't move further away, Yamada lightly placed it only Izuku's curls, much more briefly than Aizawa's rough presses, more proof of concept than anything else. Hey, little listener. I was just thinking. You're kind of amazing, you know that. Izuku blinked. He really didn't know that. Yamada huffed. Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. But, hey, I've got to say, not everyone has a fully functional information network before they hit high school. Izuku flatlined, he could feel his brain sending up signals and his body ignoring them completely. The result was a high, squeaky voice. Information network? Yamada scowled, but in an exaggerated playful manner, shaking finger included. You can't fool me. Should've kept me pretty up to date with your consulting exploits, and if there's 2 things I know, it's people and information. His eyes lit up and he looked around the empty hallway. Okay, come on, one last stop. There's something you have to see. They ended up 3 levels above in a room with computers and very comfortable chairs. It was a rather plain room, to be honest. Yamada gestured Izuku to a chair as he bounced forward, seemingly unconcerned with Izuku's slow steps and swiveling head. The moment Yamada sat down, he was clicking and typing away, pulling up a specific program that seemed to have 2 main forms, one a search page and the other a seemingly endless spreadsheet. This is our main database. It gets information from every side of the business, hero reports, call highlights, radio surveys, and so on. There are some pretty crazy privacy protections and all the call center stuff is anonymous, but it's really helpful for analyzing trends and identifying areas of concern, which we in turn use for staffing and support at our agency, as well as provide information to other social services or educational groups as well. Izuku's mind was whirling as he watched Yamada's mouse click through the different ways of sorting data and the graphing and table features. Like crime statistics, but broader. Like if you identified an upswing in certain keywords from the call center, like increasing tags of bullying and quirkism, then you can provide a training course to the call center, get a hero to do some school visits, and run a couple segments about equality or personal stories on the radio. Exactly. Yamada clapped his hands together. We have people, proper analysts and all that, here he grinned at Izuku, that spend most of their time on this stuff. But I like to keep my hand in to make sure I'm still relevant and helping the right people. Also, well, it used to be just me and my laptop scrolling news sites and social media on Shura's beat-up couch every Sunday. I've always enjoyed this part, and thought you might too. Izuku could barely manage a nod and decided that sitting on his fingers was really his best option. Yamada passed him the mouse. Have at it. When Izuku just looked from the mouse to the screen to Yamada, the hero just laughed. I'll provide some tips as you go, but I'd like to see what you come up with. Izuku stuttered something out. He wasn't sure what exactly, but he was pretty sure the words, privacy, and me, were in there somewhere. Yamada leaned back, the chair creaking slightly as he crossed tan arms. Look, little listener, Midoriya, you're a paid hero consultant and the official intern to Eraserhead, who's very purposely on our books as a frequent associate. These things absolutely mean that you have clearance for far more information that you think you do, and that's without whatever nonsense Nizu's currently arranging in your name. Sure, Sho will need to sign some papers later, but you've earned this. I trust you. Izuku took the mouse with fingers that were suddenly perfectly still, wrapped securely in warm words. He turned to the screen, loosing himself in numbers and patterns so he wouldn't have to find words he currently didn't have. It didn't take long to get absorbed, to start looking up things like suicide rates and quirk types. Yamada didn't flinch at the subject matter and even showed him how to import data from the Hero Commission databases that Aizawa had already made sure Izuku could access. There were so many possibilities if he handled this right, and Izuku knew he could handle this right, particularly with his mom, Aizawa-sensei, Grand-sensei, and present Mike to guide him. He didn't even notice the time flow by until Yamada made a loud, satisfied sound, clicked a few things on the computer next to Izuku's, and reached with long fingers for a USB device he'd inserted sometime during Izuku's odd exploration. With a deliberate tap, Yamada placed the device next to Izuku's bag. I can't give you permanent access, at least until Sho or Niza gets you a secure laptop, so hopefully this will tide you over. I mean, you're more than welcome to join me another day in this room. Man, your brain is wild, but this is the baby version of the software. It has all the basic components of the program I showed you, just none of the data. You can use it for your little information network. Yamada grinned as Izuku opened his mouth to protest. Hush, you gremlin child. I'm not asking any questions, though please let me be there where Sho Yuta figures out you have an entire spy network. I want his expression on film. Anyways, I'm sure you'll have no problem anonymizing everything, but you should ask about security measures when your hacking lessons with Nizu start. Izuku picked up the bright yellow plastic and wanted to cry. Instead, he reached up for the thin cord around his neck. He bypassed the key to his desk drawer that held 2 notebooks and removed another, sleeker USB while hooking Yamada's gift in its place. With completely steady hands, Izuku inserted the sleek USB into the computer and opened his presentation, the little rat animatic welcoming him and Yamada both. They still had time before lunch for a streamlined overview of Plan R. Aizawa-sensei had gotten him up early, after all. And Izuku didn't think Nizu-sensei would mind. Their plan had come far from its inception in Izuku's bedroom and Nizu's office and gotten a surprising number of approvals considering their rather quick timeline. Nizu-sensei had grinned, all teeth, when Izuku pointed that out. Besides, Yamada was a teacher, Aizawa's friend, and clearly possessed the best social skills of anyone Izuku knew, barring possibly his mother. Izuku wanted Yamada's opinion, wanted his plan to be the best it possibly could, especially now that he had permission to ask, to recruit participants, and therefore couldn't screw things up. There's something I'd like your opinion on, and well, maybe your help with implementing. Yamada turned bright and eager eyes to the screen, kindness around his mouth, and an ear facing Izuku. Izuku was getting help. Because he was a hero, and he wasn't alone. Everything started with a coffee. A coffee from a particular cafe on a particular corner across from a particular school. A coffee that wasn't stalking or surveillance or spying, thank you Tsukachi, Hizashi, and Inko. Eraserhead had that coffee at different times almost every day for 3 weeks and learned that he wasn't impressed with Izuku's school. He hadn't been impressed with the school since the first day he'd stood at his corner, leaned against a cold metal lamppost, and watched 2 sets of kids, one rowdy with flashy quirks and one meek with plain quirks, walk through the gates. Now that Shoyuta had spent a month with his problem child's brilliant kindness, and his problem child's abysmal self-esteem, Shoyuta wanted to burn the building down. Shoyuta tossed today's perfectly full coffee in the trash. It had nothing on Inko's coffee and also didn't come in a cat mug, and pushed off from the lamppost with just a tad more force than necessary. School had well and truly started by now, and Hizashi and Izuku were probably well on their way into bright-eyed trouble. So Shoyuta met very few people as he made his way onto the school grounds and towards the principal's office. He took great pleasure at walking across the office in his hero's gait, only stopping to win a glaring contest with a secretary with a permanent scowl. The young man froze halfway out of his seat, mouth open but not a sound coming out. Which was, of course, exactly enough time for Shoyuta to reach the closed door and swing it open with a truly satisfying bang. The principal's office was clearly getting thorough maintenance and oiled hinges, which could not be said for some of the classrooms and student facilities. Fine, there may have been some surveillance involved, but only after the warning signs had become particularly evident. The principal turned her equally oiled smile onto Shoyuta, and he immediately wanted to take a bath. One with fancy and very expensive soap. I'm currently occupied in a meeting right now. If you could please wait outside for a moment, I'll be right with you. We're just wrapping up. Shoyuta tilted his head for a moment, trying to decide whether the principal's voice sounded like nails on a chalkboard or the chirping of those tiny, perpetually angry dogs. He might have been projecting just a bit. Then again, a look at the other participants in the meeting had Shoyuta thinking that he quite probably wasn't projecting at all. Tsukachi was wearing his "I am a professional and therefore violence is wrong" face. Inko was clutching her overlarge purse with white-knuckled fingers and clearly calculating her exact route to smacking the woman across her over the head with said bag. We aren't wrapping up, Inko said. The principal blinked slitted pupils. Of course, I'm happy to discuss Midoriya, but perhaps another time could be scheduled for you and your brother. Brother? Aizawa asked. Tsukachi tilted his head. I mentioned I had some concerns about my nephew. She assumed. Ah. Right. The principal seemed a little off balance. Shoyuta couldn't wait to kick the chair from under her. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Sir? She made a gesture with one thin hand, politely asking for Shoyuta to leave the room and thus avoid a possible witness to the scene brewing in front of her. Shoyuta smiled. The principal flinched. Eraserhead. Pro-hero Eraserhead. He prowled forward, throwing his ID on the desk in front of her before hitching a hip and sitting on the edge of her desk in a way that could only be described as looming. And I'm in the right meeting. The principal's hand trembled as she reached for the ID, but her spine straightened as she looked back and met his eyes. Shoyuta would have been impressed, but he'd hugged a boy on this building's roof who'd been trembling under the weight of a mask made of sharpened glass and shards of mirror. I see. I'm uncertain what Mrs. Midoriya has said to convince you to attend her action-seeking habits, but I assure you, your presence is unnecessary. Her son is quirkless and as such has a deep jealousy for his quirked peers. He constantly disrupts class and redirects attention better spent guiding his peers into heroes and proper members of society. He's rude, inarticulate, and constantly getting into fights. The principal stopped for a moment to redirect her scorn onto Mrs. Midoriya, who had very deliberately let go of her bag and appeared to be practicing deep breathing exercises. Mrs. Midoriya has brought frankly ridiculous concerns of bullying and misconduct to our attention multiple times, and each had been disproved after a thorough inquiry. Did you ever receive notice of the culmination of these inquiry? Tsukachi leaned forward, recapturing the attention of both the principal and Inko. Inko shook her head. I was never even told they were starting an inquiry, she said quietly. Just because you lost the notices dash. Then we would like to request copies of the complete records and full findings of these inquiries, Tsukachi interjected. Of course. The principal had an odd look on her face, like she wanted to sneer but couldn't quite bring herself to do so with a pro-hero in the room. That will take time, I'm sure you understand. Completed inquiries into false claims are hardly the priority of my school. Tsukachi tilted his head, staring at the principal with cool eyes. I rather think it's you who don't understand. Excuse me? No? Shoyuta grinned again, all teeth. I don't think we will. I'd hurry and find that evidence if I were you. Evidence? There was the scowl. Evidence. Shoyuta nodded, then pulled a rather thick folder out from one of his hidden pockets and let it thump to the table with a rush of spilling papers. Like that. She didn't look through the folder, didn't take her eyes off Shoyuta. That was the survival instinct kicking in, not that they would help her here. Shoyuta had the file memorized, anyways. Lists of structural damage. Improperly stored chemicals. Safety hazards. Broken lights. Mysterious stains and substances. Improperly cared for equipment, particularly those relating to quirk training. I mean, I'm a hero, not a building inspector or member of the school board, but I gathered this from a basic walkthrough. Lady, your school looks like it's been hit by a squad of villains and left for a 3-year-old with some duct tape and a glue stick to patch back together. These are bright children with strong quirks and futures in heroics. You clearly don't understand that some damage dash. Oh right. Shoyuta dug in his pocket before throwing another piece of ID onto the principal's desk. He placed both palms over the smooth metal and leaned forward. Forgot to give that to you earlier. His UA teacher's ID stared up at them both, along with bright red words that marked him as being a qualified talent scout. What was that about me not understanding hero students and their needs? Tsukachi stood up, letting his chair scrape across the floor with a loud sound and drawing attention. Before the principal could speak. Seems I'm also a bit forgetful. He put his badge next to Shuta's ID far more gently, for all that his coat flared with the anger he wasn't showing. The principal broke her pen, then tried to hide it and her hands on her lap. Inko stood up next, not hesitating to take that step forward and place herself in line with the two men. I don't have a badge, as you well know. So this will have to suffice. She reached down into her massive bag and pulled out 3 notebooks, the same brand as most of her sons. Hers, however, were not neat and tidy with only the occasional scorch mark to mar them. Hers were bursting at the seams with cutouts and pockets and the visible edges of receipts. They were scrapbooks more than notebooks. These are my records of every single communication I have had with this school. Notes home about my son being a bully. The receipts for medical supplies or doctor's visits from the same date as those notes. Report cards with corresponding assignments or tests. The same assignments completed by Bakugo Katsuki, provided by his mother who has been a friend of mine since our own school days. The discrepancy in grading is intriguing. A copy of every single email, note, and phone transcript I have had with this school, containing every single concern, complaint, and worry I have passed on, and the reply or lack thereof. She reached into her bag and pulled out a much thinner notebook and added it to the pile. A list of names and contact information for other parents. They may not want to help the quirkless boy, but a police investigation into quirkism and malpractice? What? This school doesn't only have students with strong quirks, and just because my son was the easiest target hardly means he was the only one. Most of them are quite willing to talk to us. My officers have been taking statements for several hours now. Witness testimony isn't always perfectly reliable, but it does tend to carry more weight under certain circumstances. Tsukachi crossed his arms. Such as overwhelming volume or credibility. The credibility, in case you weren't paying attention, comes from the detective you just tried to brush off and the pro-hero who watched you do it, Shoyuta added. Would you like to come give your statement voluntarily, to be taken in for questioning? The principal blinked at Tsukachi's question. Midoriya Inko smiled. The principal chose to be taken in for questioning and Shoyuta was very pleased. Well, actually, she'd chosen to try and talk herself out of any and all culpability, throwing blame at everyone from the school board to the custodian, but that hadn't been one of the options. Shoyuta may have taken several pictures of the woman being marched down empty hallways in H&D-CFFS. He figured Inko needed to start a new, happier, scrapbook. The bell rang, and Shoyuta smiled again. He knew Tsukachi had timed their departure perfectly. The detective was a petty little sheet, which was both well hidden and one of their main bonding points, and thus several classes of students were getting a good look at their principal and her new accessories. Shoyuta, alas, would have to get that satisfaction secondhand. He had another appointment to keep. He turned to Inko, meeting her green steel eyes and the grimly satisfied expression on her face. "I'm thinking 15 minutes. She tilted her head. "I'll give it 20. You'll need the extra 5 for bluster." "Got it." Shoyuta opened the door and met burning red eyes. "Hello, Bakugu." He walked forward and pulled out the chair across from the boy and his parents. With significantly more respect and control than he'd displayed earlier, he placed both his hero and UA IDs on the table so the boy could see them. "I'm Eraserhead. I'm an underground dash. I know who you are." The boy was grinning and Shoyuta felt his temple throb. Yeah, he wasn't going to get through this being respectful. "Stop smirking. You don't know Jack." The boy froze for the barest of moments before falling back into his cocky slouch, briefly uncertain now that the script had been changed. Shoyuta looked up briefly at his parents, but neither seemed upset with Shuta's approach. They were grimly determined, much like they'd been the last time Shoyuta had talked to them. He was glad. He'd been afraid they'd backslide or lose their resolve over this last week as the pieces had come together. Shoyuta pulled out another file, opened it, and laid out Bakugu's academic transcript, letters of recommendation, and application to UA. The entrance exam was still a month away, but Shoyuta had administrative access granted within his first week as a UA teacher. Nizu was gleeful in passing off his paperwork to his one student. He tapped the transcript with one blunt fingernail. "This is functionally useless." He tapped the recommendations. "This is absolutely useless." He placed a palm on the application. "This has been rejected." "Ha!" Bakugu stood up, sparking palms catching on the desk, and was immediately slammed down by his mother's hand on his shoulder. Bakugu didn't notice. He was too busy staring at his palms. Shoyuta figured that after relying on his quirk for everything, being rendered quirkless might be a little jarring. Too bad he didn't really care. This boy had hurt Izuku with those palms. Two red glares met across the table, Shoyuta quite comfortable winning a glaring and scowling contest with a teenager. A moment 3 heartbeats long, and he blinked, letting his hair sink down and not bothering to brush it back from his face. "You are a bully and a criminal. We don't take those at UA." Bakugu flinched as Shoyuta had meant him to, but not as hard as his parents. The boy recovered by crossing his arms, the black sleeves pulling tight and highlighting white knuckles. Shoyuta was slightly impressed. Seems the boy could bow to authority when he respected it, and he did respect pro-heroes. Then again, the boy also averted his eyes, and not from shame. He was planning on ignoring that statement. Then, with a sigh, Shoyuta placed one last file on the table, this one marked with the police emblem. "Bakugu Katsuki. I don't make these claims lightly. I'm sure you saw the police presence in your school even before the officers escorted you and your family to this room. Your entire school is undergoing an investigation for corruption, child endangerment, quirkism, and at least 50 different health and safety violations. Your teachers' opinions don't mean shit. Grades are grades." Shoyuta tilted his head at the challenge. "Naive." Bakugu clenched his fingers. "Shut up." Shoyuta really didn't want to let the boy talk. He'd talked too much already. "Bias is rampant in this school, and I think you know that." The boy looked away but muttered, "I earned those marks." "I believe you." The kid whipped his head up, red eyes confused, and was mirrored by both of his parents. "It just doesn't matter after what your teachers did. SCKS, doesn't it? When one person or group ruins something for everyone." Shoyuta leaned back, his muscles protesting and a recent scar pulling taut across his stomach. He wondered if these kids, all of these kids who wanted to be heroes, knew how much the job actually hurt. Izuku did, Izuku twisted and winced the same way a seasoned pro would, and it made Shoyuta angry and twisted knots of shadow and anxiety in his stomach more sharply than any scar. You also earned juvie. The parents flinched this time, and Bakugo eyed them both. What? Your school is going down. We have evidence, testimonials, video footage from nearby businesses. Bakugo, I have enough proof of you violating quirk use laws in order to harm other kids to send you to juvie. Assault is serious enough without the quirk to have earned you at least a trial and a mark black enough to rob you of your chance at any hero school. It wasn't that bad. Bakugo crossed his arms and sunk farther into his seat, not a retreat, but an attempt at casual control. The attempt failed spectacularly when he tensed at the soft question that came next. Are you sure? Inko had entered the room softly, the angle of the door blocking her from view until she slid into place at Shuta's shoulder. She stood firm and elegant, a swan among geese. Swans were vicious, they just hid it under white feathers and arcing necks. She placed a large bin, bulky enough to need her to hold it with both hands, on the table just off to Bakugo's side. This is the first aid kit Izuku had under his bed. Over half of it is supplies for treating burns. Over half. She leaned forward, not meeting the blanched faces of her friends, though Shoyuta knew she'd had a long talk with them earlier in the week. And just to be clear, I meant hidden under his bed. Because Izuku didn't tell me anything. Because Izuku didn't rat out this rat-infested school. Because Izuku, when asked, still said that you would be a great hero. There were tears running down her face, but her words were as clear as crystal shards lit by lightning. I treated you like a nephew, Katsuki. I made you cakes and proofread your papers and brought your favorite books home with me each week. I loved you, nephew, and I'm not naive. I know you weren't the only bully harming my son, but you didn't save him either. My quirkless son needed a hero closer than All Might, and for all your talk, you never saved him. Her arms twitched like she wanted to wrap them around herself, and Shoyuta glowered at Mitsuki when she took a step forward. So, I ask you again, Katsuki, nephew, are you sure it wasn't that bad? Because I didn't know how bad it was, and I still knew it was bad enough that I might come home one day to find no one there. Bakugo was staring at the first aid kit, fingers flexing repeatedly and completely unable to look at Inko's tears. Shoyuta hoped he was stared at the flecks of rusted blood occasionally visible through the clear plastic, flecks that drove daggers into Shuta's gut. Why are you here then? Bakugo turned on Shoyuta, ignoring his parents and Inko completely, though there was a grain to his voice. A sign of strain that the boy's bravado wouldn't have let show before. If I'm a failure and if up, why are you here? Bakugo had injected enough venom into his voice that he should have sounded angry, but he really just sounded like a boy with his whole world crushed to dust around him. Shoyuta could see the kid beneath the bluster shockingly clearly, and what was worse, could see the way that venom would seep from the kid's voice into his bones. Shoyuta may have called him a criminal, and he did use his quirk in ways that hurt people and broke the law, but the kid was still a kid. He wasn't a villain, yet, just a bully with a dream of being better. And the dream, according to Izuku, was the important bit. Izuku, who didn't want revenge so much as reform, who wanted his childhood friend to be better instead of to be hurt. Shoyuta sighed out the tension from his shoulders and the anger in his gut, letting himself sway forward slightly as he laid a final folder with UA's logo on the cover. Because you aren't a failure and AF up. You have failed and you have F'd up, yes, but so has almost everyone around you. And honestly, you're not that special. The kid blinked, perturbed. Shoyuta ran a hand over the folder, the scars littering his fingers standing out against the blue of the paper. UA has recognized that there are a number of kids who, for various reasons, would never meet our traditional acceptance standards. Kids facing homelessness, enduring abuse, undergoing discrimination, practicing vigilantism. Kids who have potential, if the various pitfalls of society weren't beating it out of them. Shoyuta tilted his head and flicked the file open, refusing to let Bakugo's gaze go. UA is running a pilot program, Class 1R. There's still an entrance exam. Though applicants need to be invited and only 12 or so students will be in the class. It's not a heroics class. Traditional coursework will be completed with practical quirk training focusing on control, but either transferring into the heroic course or streamlining into apprenticeships will be very much an option. The goal is individual support and growth. Applications will also include professional assessments and recommendations of therapy or anger management, which will be requirements for graduation. All the details are in the package, including the contact information for Ectoplasm and Hound Dog, who will be spearheading the program along with Principal Nizu. They'd be happy to take your questions. Bakuga's fingers drifted across the pages, but he didn't flick through them, too busy staring at Shoyuta, who stared right back, the bags under his eyes weighing him in place. Shuta's kid was too diamond kind and too diamond brilliant. Izuku and Nizu had come up with the bones of the program, really FING solid bones, but it had been Shoyuta and Nizu who'd been tap dancing across regulations to get this thing up and going for the following school year, tap dancing with a dash of blackmail, and Shoyuta didn't actually want to know how Nizu got the go-ahead from the commission. Ectoplasm and Hound Dog had been FANG gifts as well, and Shoyuta owed them so much coffee. Between Ectoplasm's injury, his quirk, and his aesthetic, the man knew a thing or two about overcoming difficulty. Hound Dog had a volatile quirk of his own and several very solid reasons to be the fully certified professional working as a guidance counselor at a school for teenagers being trained for combat. The two had jumped at the idea. Their reactions to Izuku had been hilarious. Both heroes had been approached by Nizu, who'd only thrown out that the idea came from someone working with Aizawa. Izuku hadn't met the two heroes until they'd been fully immersed in the idea for weeks, helping to flesh it out and get it off the ground. The faces of Ectoplasm and Hound Dog when they realized the creator of one was a teenager was hilarious, but not nearly as precious as when they decided to say F it and throw praise at the teenager anyways. Shoyuta and Nizu had both spammed the group chat with photos of Izuku getting fanboyed at for the first time, and Tsukachi and Inko both had new frames on their desks. Regardless, it was a good program and Bakuga's best option. And the kid knew it. He looked up at his mother for the first time since Shoyuta came in the door. Bakuga Mitsuki shook her head, shaggy hair drifting across her face. "No, kid, don't look at us. We love you." Her husband wrapped an arm around her waist and nodded. "We love you so much, but we're disappointed as F dashed." Bakuga's eyes widened slightly before whipping down back to scowl at Shoyuta and the new UA application. Bakuga Masaru tapped the application. "It's your choice, we'll support you either way, but you need to make the choice. This is where all our actions landed us. Time to take responsibility." Bakuga op-ed his mouth again, but Shoyuta cut in. They'd gotten through this meeting with surprisingly little bluster by a combination of completely blindsiding the boy and emotional warfare. He didn't want to lose that edge. "What? Going to say that it's not fair?" "It isn't. Not at all. This school and these adults failed you miserably and are going to jail for it while leaving you addition. But hey, at least you're uninjured. At least you don't have bruises and cuts and burns tracing over your skin. At least you have a choice. At least you've never stood on a roof and had to tell a stranger that you weren't going to jump." Shoyuta leaned forward, palms flat on the table and Eraserhead wrapped around his words like a threat. "I'm telling you, as a teacher of heroes and a pro myself, that you currently don't have what it takes. You still want to be a hero? Fine. Prove me wrong. Prove Izuku right." Shoyuta stood in an empty hall and breathed. He heard footsteps echo, but didn't open his eyes, somehow having come to recognize both of the incoming gates without conscious thought. "Ready for phase 2? He asked. Inko's hand slipped around his arm and she leaned her head on his shoulder. "Absolutely." Her voice was the soft of an assassin's creep. "I'm so effing ready." Shoyuta opened his eyes at the bite in Tsukachi's tone. The detective shrugged with a lopsided grin. "What? This was fun and needed, but phase 2 is my mess to clean up. And I'm going to do so even if I have to smack him upside the head myself." Inko giggled. "I'll loan you my purse." Tsukachi nodded. "I accept your offer." Shoyuta was escorted out of the school by a short woman planning what kind of snacks went with a good threatening scolding and then waved goodbye to a lanky man planning the kidnapping of a public figure. He walked by the coffee shop without a second glance and felt the best he'd felt all week, possibly much longer than that. Everything ended with a folder. Well, 2 folders. The folders were bright blue with the UA emblem embossed on the front, and they burned holes in Izuku's bag the same way words burned in his ears. Yamada's words in particular. And Nemuri's, because Present Mike and Midnight wanted him to call them by their names. Well, their names with an uncle or aunt in front of them, but they said they'd work up to that. Izuku took a deep breath and wrapped surprisingly steady fingers around the handle of the train. It had been a really good day. Aizawa-sensei's friends had liked him and called him cute and thought he had a good head on his shoulders. He might have been paraphrasing, but to be fair, Nemuri had done a lot of cooing and also a lot of threatening and absent Shoyuta for keeping Izuku to himself for too long. So, a good day. And now Izuku had to decide if the day was going to continue being good. He had a decision to make, and despite the fact that the two blue folders in his bag kind of proved the decision already made, and despite the fact that he'd left Yamada and Nemuri after lunch with talk of an appointment that was only true in the broadest sense, he could still change his mind. He wouldn't. But he could. He had his mother and his sensei and his grand-sensei and several aunt and uncle-like people who wanted him, and this was amazing and terrifying and wonderful. He also maybe had friends. And holy F, was he scared to lose them? Izuku huffed, his breath briefly showing on the metal of the train, before squaring his shoulders and getting off at a rather dilapidated stop. He took two lefts, a back alley, a staircase, a right, and a broken metal gate before ending up in an abandoned park. An almost abandoned park. Green bean. Strong arms wrapped around Izuku's neck, and he staggered slightly before adjusting to the weight and slipping an arm around the blonde girl's waist to stabilize them both. Hey, Toga. She bounced back, though only enough to look at him up close, fangs poking up in a devilish smile. Hi. Where have you been? It's been almost a week. I've missed you. And saw a murder. Well, no, just a stabbing. But there was a hero. Do you want to hear about the hero? A sigh interrupted before Izuku could, and Dabi reached over to literally grab Toga by the scruff of her jacket and lift her a foot away. Let the kid breathe, Toga. She pouted and crossed her arms as he lowered her to the ground. But she's right. You probably want to hear about the hero. They're new, but did a pretty solid job. Didn't even sneer at us bottom feeders. Maybe later? Both Dabi and Toga both paused mid-movement to turn and stare at him. Is he sick? Toga tilted her head. Nope, replied Dabi. That's his business face. The older teenager promptly sat on a bench, his oversized coat flaring dramatically in move that Izuku had one caught him practicing. Ah. Togo dropped to the ground, so she was sitting cross-legged against Dabi's knee. Excellent. Who is it today? A murderer? A murder victim? A missing kid? Dabi gave Toga's head a resigned pat and then left his hand there as if he could control her bouncing through its weight. He smirked up at Izuku. Oh, tell us, great spy master and provider of sandwiches and steamed buns. Izuku blushed. He had maybe been spending all of his allowance and then a lot of his consulting paycheck on food and clothes for his network. Sure, a lot of what he did was based on information and mutual tip-offs, but it worked out for everyone if his network was warm and fed and more alert, right? It was payment for services in a tender his people would actually accept and use. Dabi and Toga were special. He wasn't exactly sure why. They weren't the only teens Izuku talked to that he knew lived out of shelters and alleyways and parks. They weren't even the network members he talked to the most, at least initially, though Dabi was one of his most consistent contacts from the first moment Izuku had handed him a newspaper article covering the arrests for that first case Dabi had brought forward. It might have been the steam buns. It might have been that they all wore long sleeves. It might have been the burns, because Dabi's were definitely worse but Izuku's were in the shape of hands, and that was the kind of thing the older teen noticed. It might have the speed talking, because Toga could actually keep up with Izuku and took his mutter storms as a challenge. It might have been the fact that they were all giant nerds and once spent 4 hours breaking down one hero fight from several different angles. It might have been because they were friends. Izuku didn't know what to do with that thought, so hadn't looked too closely for fear of mirages and illusions and lies. Izuku had taken too long to answer, though, and both teens looked at him with worry in their eyes. Well, no, Toga had worry in her eyes, Dobby's worry was visible in the hands that he'd buried in coat pockets to keep his tapping out of sight. "It's fine," Izuku blurted. "Nothing bad. I want your opinion on something." The two exchanged looks before turning back to Izuku. "Okay," Dobby said slowly. Izuku looked at his hands. They were trembling again. Faint tremors that tapped out the same beat of the anxiety thrumming against his skull. He was silent as he stared at the cuts and abrasions on his fingers, for once the result of training instead of avoiding bullied and pain. He took a rattling breath full of air that tasted of mildew and leaves. "I don't have friends." That had not been what he'd meant to say. "Not since I was 4 and diagnosed quirkless. I don't even have acquaintances. I have bullies and people who are indifferent. That's not say that I don't value my group or my network, or Sheet, Eraserhead and the detective and all the others who are helping me. I think they might be my family and that is so terrifying and I love them so much, but they're not my age and they're not my friends, because I don't have those. Except I have you. You two were the first I told about Eraserhead's offer, beyond, well, my mom, and I'd already ran most of the way here before I'd even realized what I was doing. I tell you about my consulting and ask for your advice, and just complain. When I need that. When it's not fair and I can't sit with that knowledge in my brain any longer. Because you'll listen and just let me be upset even if it's something stupid, and, ever since that first success, you've just expected me to be able to keep up and help and never doubted me, and you're like friends, I think. Though I don't have those. And look, I want to help because it's what I do and I like you, and you help me so much but I have an idea. I think it's a good one. One that can help. But if you don't like it or don't want it then that's fine. I don't care. When I care. I care because I like you and I want you safe and happy, but it's absolutely your choice. I mean, I probably couldn't force you anyway, you're both scary strong, and I wouldn't try. So if you don't like it, that's fine and I'd want to keep Dash. Dobby's rough palm closed over his mouth even as Izuku felt Toga wrap both of her arms around his left elbow. "Breathe," Dobby ordered. Izuku complied, a great shuddering thing that shook his whole body and made him shake even with a line of heat pressed into his side from Toga. Dobby slipped his palm down Izuku's cheek and under his chin, cool fingers forcing, with an ash-light touch, Izuku to meet ember-dark eyes. "Tell us your idea." Dobby stepped back, slipping his hands back into deep pockets. Toga stepped closer, not loosening her hold in the slightest. "Relax, Green Bean. It's not like we're swimming in friends either. We're not going to toss you or your snacks away because of an idea. What's your scary smart brain come up with this time?" Izuku did an awkward shimmy made all the more difficult by the smiling, clinging Toga. He eventually reached into his bag and pulled out the 2 blue UA folders and their 1 are information and application packets. He handed them off to the 2 teens, Toga pouting when she finally had to release Izuku so she could flip through the information. Dobby's face quickly settled into cold blankness, but his eyes moved rapidly over each and every word. Toga went with skimming titles. "Izuku," she asked. "Izuku, this is for hero school?" "Well, sort of. It's based out of UA and the end goal would be a hero license, but the path would be a little different. It would come with dormitories and a food budget, like a scholarship, though there'd be some pretty strict behavior guidelines I'm not sure you'll appreciate. But there'd be quirk training. And medical help." He very deliberately didn't look at Toga's gaunt frame and Dobby's peeling skin. "Zuku." Toga looked at him, completely calm as Izuku had almost never seen her. "You think we could be heroes?" "What? Of course. I mean, I know neither of you really like daylight heroes, but you'd both be awesome underground heroes. I mean, I know like 5 instances in the last 2 months where a quirk like yours, Toga, would have saved Eraserhead so much work and can think of another 3 from the news where you could have gotten information so much more quickly than the police managed. And I know Dobby's been skating the edge of vigilantism for a while now. Besides, these heroes can actually help. Teaching is what they do, and Nizu-sensei's vetting procedures are meticulous. Ectoplasm, the hero in charge of the class, is really fired up about everything. And Vlad King works there too. I straight up stole some of his techniques for groundwork in my recommendations about controlling your bloodlust and iron intake. Izuku ran a hand through his hair, brain whirling as he tried to find the right words amidst all his ideas. Toga was staring at him. Dabi was staring at the papers, though his eyes had stopped moving. It's school. I know you like the idea of school. They all ignored the pleated skirt and second-hand blazer that Toga refused to swap out with practiced ease. And they'll train you how to stab people legally? Toga waited a beat, a breath, eyes wide and slightly glassy, before something shuddered and her smile fell back into place. Sold. She threw herself at Izuku and wrapped around his back, her chin resting on his shoulder so they could both turn to Dabi. They both knew he was the harder sell and that Toga wouldn't go without him. Dabi was older than them both, old enough to have gone through at least his first year of high school already, though Izuku wasn't actually sure if he had or not. Either way, Izuku and Nizu had crafted the class so age wasn't an issue, recognizing that sometimes life screwed up the traditional education path quite handily. Izuku had made sure to include that information in the folder he'd given Dabi. Dabi closed the folder and his eyes. Izuku. He paused, then clearly switched what he was going to say. This was your idea, wasn't it? Well, yes. Izuku reached up to run a hand through his hair. Dabi snorted. No, I mean obviously this was your idea. But you said ectoplasm was really fired up, as in you've met and talked to him. And you're talking like we're already guaranteed places. Oh, what? Kind of. I mean the idea was mine, though Nizu and Eraserhead and Ectoplasm ran with it quite a lot, though in really cool ways. I got to sit in on a lot of those meetings. And they did say they'd take my recommendations really seriously. And I've got a few from my network notes. But I wanted to offer it to you both first. Dabi ran his thumb over the UA emblem. Yes. Both Izuku and Toga perked up, though not completely. They recognized the incoming, but... Yes, I want to say yes. Toga, you should go. But, there's something I haven't told you. Oh, you're talking about Endeavor. Dabi froze, and it was only at that moment of stillness that Izuku realized how much the other teen was always moving, always shifting, always watching and ready. Toga detached herself to go stand by Dabi, not touching him, but decidedly there. I never told you that. No, Izuku shook his head, curls flying. But I've had a notebook on Endeavor since all my notebooks were dedicated to heroes. It doesn't take much research to realize something is off about that man. Then add my villain analysis, the response his agency gave me when Deku offered them a consult, Eraserhead's opinion, hero back chatter, my lovely new resources, and yes, the various things you've implied or said, and I think I have a pretty good grasp of the picture. Izuku tilted his head to look at the sky for the first time since he got to the park, though he really wasn't seeing the clouds. I mean, the words came out slowly in that way that meant he was rearranging lines and trails in his mind. There are a couple of plans to deal with him locked in that notebook at home. The timelines could be moved up. Reform was great, and Izuku was very happy with Aizawa-sensei's pride, but that didn't mean Izuku had never thought about revenge. Petty or otherwise, somehow, he thought these plans might also make Aizawa-sensei proud, and maybe it was time to test that. He looked back to Toga's delight and Dabi's disbelief. Izuku blinked when Dabi did something completely unexpected. He laughed, a sound full of rust and dust but also laced with what might have been relief. Fine. Let's go get that notebook. Wait, really? He'd never offered to take them home, not because he didn't want to or because he thought his mom wouldn't love them, but because that was a line. A very thin line made of bricks and walls and past experiences that he was quite sure they hadn't wanted to cross. Dabi handed Toga his blue folder. I'm saying yes to one are on the condition that the plan for Endeavor is suitable, which means I want to see it. He smirked. We're about to follow you into Hero Central. I think we can start with a visit to your apartment. Okay. Izuku smiled. Only if you're sure. Green bean. Dabi hooked one arm around Toga's and one around Izuku's, drawing them both out of the park. You're the spy master of an information network that puts both police and gangs to shame and got the #1 hero school in Japan to create a reform class for villains and vigilantes in what? 2 months? I'm pretty sure the plan is suitable. How hard can disgracing one corrupt hero really be in comparison? Izuku tilted his head, considering the shiny new resources that had just been given to him and the training at his fingertips. A pleasant challenge? Does this mean I get to stab Endeavor? Toga asked as she bounced along. No, Dabi said. Maybe. Izuku grinned at Dabi's flat expression and Toga's delighted cheer. I'll see what I can do. Izuku and Toga were still linked at the elbow when they approached his apartment. He wasn't really sure which one of them was stopping the other from running away, but he was grateful all the same. He pushed open the unlocked door with a hesitation so brief it would have gone unnoticed if he were with almost anyone else. Or well, anyone else who wasn't a street kid or hero or law enforcement officer. He should maybe start hanging out with less observant people, except he had family and friends now and they were precious and beloved and special. I'm home. He switched his hold to Toga's wrist and considered powering them through to his room, calling a quick, "Hi Mom, hi Dad," before coming to a complete and total halt at the sight of a skeletal man sitting hunched on his couch. Toga broke the silence, which was good, because neither Aizawa-sensei or Izuku was going to be doing that anytime soon. So, is Izuku stuck because of us or them? Dabi snorted but placed his elbows on Izuku's shoulders and his chin on Izuku's hair. I think it's actually because he called one of them Dad, and I distinctly remember him saying there wasn't one of those around. Izuku still didn't move for a moment, but then Dabi's words sunk in and he flailed. I said what? A quick look at Aizawa-sensei did show the man looking shocked blank instead of tired blank. And Aizawa-sensei ostensibly knew why All Might was sitting on Izuku's couch, so he probably wasn't surprised by that. Which mean Izuku's teacher had definitely heard Izuku call him Dad. Izuku blushed so quickly he felt his skin heat up. Aizawa opened his mouth but immediately closed it with a look of extreme gratefulness when Izuku's mom came out with a tray of snacks, followed by Tsukachi with a tray of teacups. There are a lot more people currently in my home than I expected. Possibly more than had ever been in Izuku's home, to be honest. Hi honey, welcome back. His mom blinked at the teenagers still draped over Izuku. Who's this? Oh, she blinked a bit as she walked around Aizawa. Hello, Toga. Toga bounced. Library lady. Izuku, you didn't tell me your mom was the nice library lady. Izuku hummed, but had also used the distraction to refocus on All Might who was looking very cowed. I'm told it's generally obvious. What with the hair and the smiling and the energy. And the observation and the brain and the sharpness? Dabi threw out, getting approving nods from both Aizawa and Tsukachi. We're the green beans friends, by the way. Sappy talk of affirmation and all. His mom dropped her tray, her soft gasp enough to pull Izuku's attention even before the clang and grunt of effort that was Tsukachi once again showing off his superior reflexes and snack-saving abilities. Izuku didn't actually go to his mother, since he felt both Toga and Dabi tense at the gasp, stiffening into a ready posture only found on people who've frequently had to flee situations suddenly gone wrong. Their postures quickly gained a slant of confusion, however, when his mom gave a smile of sunshine and rain showers and spring winds. I'll get more tea. Aizawa and Tsukachi gave each other a look, even as Izuku's blush got worse and he rubbed the back of his neck, half turning to face his friends. So my mom is used to me not having friends? All Might flinched, effectively drawing attention back to himself. Right? Said Aizawa, clearly happy to cut right through the emotions of everything. This idiot owes you an apology. Replied Izuku as he felt Dabi's elbows dig into his collarbones. Oh, he really does. Tsukachi finished setting the snack tray down in order to sit on the arm of the couch next to All Might. And community service by way of hours upon hours of paperwork and sensitivity training out of the police's human resources department. And a week with the rat. Aizawa-sensei shrugged. Your grand-sensei hasn't given me an itinerary yet, but there was a lot of cackling involved in its completion. And muttering, which is new. The look Aizawa-sensei shot Izuku was vaguely accusatory with a backing of pride. Tsukachi nodded and placed a palm on the back of All Might's neck and bowed both of their heads, though All Might didn't look to be struggling against the forced motion. I heard you ran into All Might's secretary, Yagi Tashinori, and he said some unkind things. I apologize for my friend. He has a chronic case of stupidity that flares up now and again. Ah. All Might blinked. Yes. He bowed again, yellow hair bobbing. I'm terribly sorry for my words. They were based on inconsistent context and heavily influenced by a terrible day and not inconsiderate pain. Though that is not an excuse. I am sorry for not properly considering the ramifications of my words. You failed to consider the ramifications of crushing a kid's dream on a roof? Izuku almost didn't recognize his own voice. He did recognize the stiffing of Dabi's spine. What? Dabi? Izuku reached out to grab a fistful of black coat that was now standing directly in front of him. No, seriously. What? Toga stepped forward as well, silent, but hands slipping into the pocket that Izuku knew held her favorite knife. Izuku reached out to grab her sleeve as well. Just in case. Stop that. It's fine. Izuku huffed when neither of his friends listened to him. Dabi said, I doubt that. Shoyuta said, it's really not. Izuku leaned around the too tall frame of his older friend to stare at his teacher. Stop encouraging violence. He arched a brow. Implicit violence is not XPLCT violence. I like him. Dabi told Izuku as Izuku finally pushed his way back between his friends. That tracks, Izuku muttered, hands splayed across Dabi's sleeve in a likely futile gesture of calm. He'd rather expected Aizawa-sensei and Dabi would get along once they got past the mutual suspicion. Apparently threats to Izuku fast-tracked the process. I promise I've been shown the error of my ways. All Might glanced between Tsukachi and Dabi but outright flinched away from a scowling Aizawa. I absolutely retract my words and have changed my opinion. Or rather, you have changed my opinion. You've done some very good work, my boy. Not yours. Aizawa crossed his arms. And not good. All heads turned to Toga, who was, thankfully, only brandishing a finger at Yagi. Zuku is the best spy master ever. What? Aizawa and Tsukachi said it together, but one voice had more glee than the other and Izuku really wasn't sure which was which. Oh, surprise? I have an information network. I mean, how else did you think I got my information? It's a very neat operation. Izuku beamed at his mom's praise as she came in with more tea. I'm very proud. Problem child. Who else knows about this? Izuku tapped his chin. Beyond the people in it? Not many. Well, there are key players and channels for people to get in contact with me, but in terms of knowing that I, personally, kind of oversee the whole thing? No one not in this room. Besides Yamada. Aizawa blinked as Tsukachi excused himself to laugh in the kitchen. My Yamada? Yes. Izuku looked over to his mother to confirm that she had noticed the possessive, she had, which was good, because Izuku had so much to say about that after listening to Yamada's pining throughout the day. He figured it out when we were talking about information mapping, databases, and trends. Aizawa sighed and buried his face in his capture weapon. I like your friends? Izuku tried to comfort him, but froze almost immediately. His sensei opened one eye. Friends? Izuku shuffled his feet a little, knocking into Toga. Yamada may have invited Namuri to lunch. They may have also decided to adopt me and you may need to watch out for some form of retribution for, and I quote, hoarding this precious little genius and denying us our auntie and uncle rights. The only sound was Tsukachi struggling to breathe in the next room, so Izuku shrugged. I like your friends. Right. Aizawa ran a hand through his hair. I like yours too. Izuku scowled as Toga cheered. You just like them because they implied violence. On your behalf, yes. Dabi snorted but Izuku's mom interrupted with a chuckle. Alright, you both have good taste in people. If we may return to business for a moment. Oh, the notebook. Right. Izuku made to dash to his room, but Dabi caught his sleeve and jerked his thumb at Yagi. I think they meant bone bag over there and his lackluster apology. Izuku stumbled at his halted momentum and then stopped. He turned around very slowly to stare at All Might. All Might, the #1 hero. All Might, the #1 hero, sitting on his couch, apologizing. This could work. Sheet. All Might turned at the return of Tsukachi, clearly hoping for some clarity from the one person he'd known at the start of the day. You're in for it, Yagi. That's his thinking face. His mom nodded as she passed a resigned-looking Aizawa a giant mug of coffee. The dangerous one. Toga tilted her head. I think that's the one he made before deciding the little old lady at the corner store was the one handing out hot chocolate laced with spite and laxatives. I mean, he was right. Dabi added. Also reminds me of the one before that creep who was harassing you disappeared. Oh. The handsy one who wasn't deterred by stabbing. That's the one. This will work. Izuku bolted for his room, rattling the 6 teacups and almost spilling the one in the red, child-sized cup. He grabbed the key from his neck, thumb tracing over both USBs, and yanked open the drawer without concern. The key didn't burn, there was no weight to the metal, no path traced across his skin by the weight of thoughts and trembling, shaking hands. Why shake when 2 notebooks had been dealt with, crafted into something useful, something good? He grabbed the 3rd, bottommost notebook. Tremble when Aizawa thought him smart enough, when Dabi needed him to be smart enough, when Nizu and Tsukachi and Toga had decided he was smart enough. Izuku grabbed Endeavor's notebook. He grabbed the preserved pages with its writing in different pens and colors and styles. He grabbed the statistics and charts and notices folded inside. Izuku smiled as ideas whirled through his mind and were held tight in his hands. The smile was Aizawa-sensei's, bone-bleached edges sharp and creeping. Everything escalated with a notebook. Shoyuta wasn't surprised by this. Exactly. So much of his life seemed to come back to messy words scrawled across cheap paper, or not so cheap, because his student deserved nice things and cat-themed notebooks were almost as adorable as said student. Still, as Izuku came barreling back into the room without his bag but clutching 2 blue folders and the most pristine notebook Shoyuta had ever seen in Izuku's collection, Shoyuta just knew things were going to get interesting. Though how they were going to get more interesting than an emaciated #1 hero sitting on the couch of a woman who was one of the most effective interrogators Shoyuta had ever seen, well, Shoyuta couldn't begin to guess. Plus Ultra may as well be the Midori Yamato. Shoyuta hooked his arm out, catching his student in the chest, and shuffled the boy into a chair. Chairs made looming much more effective. Out of the corner of his eye, Shoyuta caught the tensing of the older teen, Dabi, and approved. The boy hadn't been more than an arm's reach from the girl since they entered and he'd kept himself between Izuku and Yagi almost as long. Problem child. Aizawa-sensei? Izuku asked, not alarmed in the slightest by his sudden change in position. Settle. Breathe. Then talk. What? Shoyuta didn't sigh, because the kid might take that the wrong way. The kid, not his son, because he wasn't about to take Izuku's earlier slip-up the wrong way either, despite the warm and spiked feelings that absolutely weren't in his gut. Instead, Shoyuta slowly reached forward and grabbed a bony wrist, angling Izuku's hand so he could see the tremble, but the rest of the room's sightlines would have been blocked by Shuta's body. Oh! And the kid sounded sad. I thought that had stopped. Shoyuta reached into one of the pockets in his pants and pulled out a smaller version of his capture weapon that he used as both restraints and bandages when the situation called for it. He started wrapping it around Izuku's wrist to the boy's soft bemusement. The trembles didn't stop, exactly, but they settled a bit, and Izuku leaned into the touch, his breath evening out with each loop. It's energy, problem child. You're going too fast again. How many plans are going through that brain of yours? Izuku opened his mouth but didn't get to answer, as Toga plopped down on the floor by his knee holding 2 teacups that splashed just slightly. A resigned-looking Dabi had followed her more slowly, settling in with a lean against the wall after skirting the room with wary eyes. Dabi seemed to relax a bit when Shoyuta was between him and the rest of the room, which was interesting. Shoyuta didn't usually have that effect on people unless he was between them and an actual attacker, and not always then either. Tea. Toga shoved the cup at Izuku, who had to put the folders and notebook on his lap to accept it, since Shoyuta hadn't finished with his other arm yet. Toga waited until he'd had a couple good sips before nodding and turning to her own a cup, humming just slightly. Shoyuta accepted this, appreciated the help in taking care of the problem child, even, since Inko was running herd on her other guests, her trust, her permission was its own soothing, bracing presence. So, plans? Izuku blinked up and started muttering about 1R, the notebook, endeavor, Nizu, and backup plans. Which wasn't great, since it meant the boy didn't know where to start or when to stop. Shoyuta had quickly learned that notebooks were both meticulous records and clear evidence of Izuku's intelligence. They were also a coping mechanism, though he wasn't sure how much the kid realized that. They were a coping mechanism for the shitty hand he'd been dealt, a way of dealing with the abuse and focusing on something else entirely, but they were also a way for dealing with his own mind. Shoyuta had seen a similar frenzy in Nizu a couple times over the years, though very rarely and almost always accidentally, when Shoyuta was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. He felt it occasionally creeping on him, too, when the thoughts were too much and he couldn't turn off the patterns and people and the predictions. Shoyuta went to Hizashi, then let the man feed him and babble about English songs and work gossip that Shoyuta really didn't care about beyond the cadence of Hizashi's voice and the sound drowning out Shuta's thoughts. Izuku didn't have a Hizashi. He loved his mother, but tried to protect her rather more than his mother appreciated. So he used the notebooks. Used them to get out the words that were taking up too much space in his mind and trace the edges of plans and courses that were useful and could be followed up on. They were release and organization both. Shoyuta finished the wrapping and switched his hold to loose pressure on his kid's wrist. Several plans, then, and they're interweaving, right? Izuku nodded around his tea while Dabi raised an eyebrow from his own watchful spot against the wall. Okay, which one's first? Izuku tilted his head. 1R, except Endeavor needs to go first or in the middle, since he'd impeding 1R, sort of. And Endeavor isn't one plan, exactly. Izuku pulled his hand away to trail over the yellow cover of the notebook in his lap. That wasn't helpful, exactly, either. Though it was leading. Can I pick a starting point, then? Shoyuta asked, and got a relieved nod in response. Why did you bring Dabi and Toga here? That flinching. I like your friends, remember? I appreciate the fact that the scary one was ready to stab a hero's secretary for you. Wait, Dabi interrupted. He pointed at himself. I'm not the scary one? Shoyuta rolled his eyes, which was worth it for the way Izuku giggled. She has more knives on her than I do. Toga giggled and placed her head against crossed arms over raised knees. I like you too, Mr. Gloomy. He was going to have to introduce her to Midnight, wasn't he? He gave her blonde head a pat, ignoring how she tensed and then practically melted. He supposed it was a good thing that Izuku had practically destroyed all of his barriers for physical affection. Thanks. So, I like your friends, and while I can't welcome them to your home, you can. Izuku sat up straighter than he had all afternoon. It's your home too, Inko said as she placed the snack plate closer to Shoyuta and the teens. She turned to stare at Shoyuta, emerald edges in her gaze. We adopted you, remember? She returned to Yagi and Tsukachi, the latter who was distracting his friend and letting the kids and Shoyuta have their moment. He was also holding back more laughter, if the tension on his back was to be believed. Shoyuta sighed. He just couldn't hold it in anymore. Thankfully, Izuku just grinned. Dabi was studying Inko's back. So adopting strays off the street is a family thing then? Yes. Shoyuta poked Izuku's cheek to regain his attention and distract himself from the fing heat curling around his bones and pooling in his stomach. So, your friends are welcome, but why are they being introduced now? He also gave a pointed look at the 2-1R folders sitting under the notebook on his student's lap. Oh, Dabi and Toga want to join 1R. Or apply, at least, but they're really good candidates. They made a couple of bad choices. Don't glare at me, Dabi. I know about the job you pulled last month, but they were both abandoned by their family and were screwed over by their quirk or society's perception of their quirk, and they're tired and distrustful but good people who want change and would be excellent underground heroes and . And the problem is what? Shoyuta interrupted. You know we trust you. My understanding is at least half the prospective students for the pilot are based on your recommendations. You wouldn't be worried or bring them back here unless there was an issue. Shoyuta was betting this was the part that connected back to Endeavor. He was also betting that saying that out loud wasn't the best of ideas currently. Both because he generally tried to lead Izuku through snarls without being too obvious, he was a teacher, damn it, and because Dabi had just gotten a heck of a lot more tense. Izuku huffed, a small, angry sound Shoyuta wasn't used to hearing. The problem is Dabi's family. If they find out, they won't be happy. I see. You don't. Dabi said to the ceiling. And just my father. The rest of them, they're fine. His father's a hero. Shoyuta hissed. Yeah, that would be tricky. Doable because Nizu and problem child, but tricky. He angled his head toward the rest of the room where the number one hero, a detective, and a librarian were discussing the weather, as in, the likely impacts of a particularly wet season on food availability, immigration, and minor villainy. Izuku nodded and Dabi sighed, so Shoyuta took the acceptance he'd be given and stood. Hey, Tsukachi, we might need to kidnap another hero. Tsukachi looked up even as Inko clapped her hands together once. Phase 3. Wait, what was Phase 2? Or 1. Wait, is this why I was pawned off on Yamada this morning? Izuku leaned forward and waved both arms, Toga once again in possession of his tea. Not that I didn't enjoy that. Yamada was amazing and the radio station was amazing, but what was Phase 1? The complete and utter destruction of your former school. Izuku stared at his mother, then looked between Tsukachi and Shoyuta. I was only with Yamada a couple of hours? It was a long-term plan that came together this morning. Tsukachi leaned back, half his weight on an amused Yagi. I haven't had such a series of satisfying arrests in a while. I'll need to check back in at my station soon. I'm really only able to be out this long because someone mentioned the amount of overtime I've been working lately. Good. Everyone looked to Toga, who was still cross-legged on the floor. She grinned, teeth flashing. That school was mean. You deserved better. She gave Izuku's knee a pat as he looked down rather helplessly at her. I'm not sure about the kidnapping thing though. The last hero made it pretty easy. Tsukachi didn't look at Yagi, since Toga and Dabi weren't supposed to know he was a hero, nor were Shoyuta and Inko, but Shoyuta and Inko had been persistent, clever, and angry. They'd figured it out. Shoyuta just shrugged. Midnight would help. She's always wanted to punch Endeavor in the face. The last was muttered quietly enough that only the kids could hear, and the look that Dabi shot Shoyuta was immensely satisfying. Why are we kidnapping another hero? Inko asked. Because Dabi's father is a hero and abusive and would get in the way of him attending 1R. She hummed. Can't we just kidnap Dabi then? Tsukachi pinched the bridge of his nose. This is my fault. I started this and I recognize that. Okay, first things first. She turned to the kids. I have a lie detector quirk. I'm not here to interrogate you, obviously, since I didn't know you were coming, but I can't turn it off. So, just a heads up. Both Dabi and Toga looked at him for a moment, heads angled together. Thanks. We get it. At the evident surprise of his easy acceptance, he shrugged. Quirks are stupid and people always lie. That must SCK. Tsukachi slumped a little. It really can. So, is there a better plan than kidnapping? Because again, the last hero went pretty willingly, and I would rather not discuss outright. Breaking the law. Yes. Izuku stood up, placing the blue folders on the chair and taking the notebook with him as he went and stood before Yagi. The older hero straightened up, losing some of his amused wariness as he focused directly on the boy he'd hurt, and Shoyuta would never have let the two of them be in the same room if he didn't think the man sincere in his apology, but he still kinda wanted to turn with Inko's purse. I accept your apology. Yagi blinked and Dabi sighed, but Shoyuta beat them to actual words. You don't have to. Tsukachi leaned into his friend, elbows digging in carefully, because the man was a walking injury, but firmly. You really don't. I know. Izuku replied. But I do. The situation SEKD and his response wasn't entirely unreasonable. Besides, Izuku raised his voice as at least 3 people drew breath to defend him. I'm better now. Everything's better. I like how things worked out. Izuku took another few steps. But Yagi smiled, a little bitterly, clearly used to there being a but. You're a good person and I forgive you, but you owe me. And I want to collect. All right. Izuku was clearly a bit thrown at the easy acceptance. Truthfully, so was Shoyuta. Light glanced off Yagi's cheekbones as the hero gave a slight smile. You're a good person too. I missed out on a chance to help you before. I'd like to take that chance now. Izuku hummed. You might regret that. I fully plan on using you and your power. Perhaps. But not more than I regret our last meeting. Izuku looked up to Shoyuta, and Shoyuta bit back a grin. He loved that expression. The kid's eyes darted from the child's teacup, still untouched on the tray, and up to the vent in the wall, and Shoyuta stopped repressing his expression for the instant his kid needed to read the confirmation. Izuku threw his notebook on the table in front of Yagi, printouts, maps, statistics, and more spilling over the edge and onto the floor. We're taking down Endeavor. Excellent! Nizu exclaimed, paws now around his favorite cup. Tsukachi gave a shriek Shoyuta would never let him live down, and tumbled into a flustered Yagi's lap. Inko was already reaching for the papers and handed Shoyuta an official document that was clearly a response to some information Izuku had tried to pass on as the consultant Deku. The words, Endeavor's agency and not his own, still set Shuta's blood to writhing. He and Inko shared a look before he bared his teeth. We're in. Like he was going to let his kid take on a giant by himself. Hizashi and Namuri could hit the ground running if they wanted to be involved so badly, they might never forgive him if he denied them the change to nail Endeavor. Dabi sunk to the floor and let Toga pat his head. What the actual F dashed? I love my family. Izuku said, offering the words like an explanation, before handing the scarred Tina cookie and drawing Shuta's and Nizu's attention to the back half of his notebook that had clearly been influenced by Nizu's lessons on public perception. Shoyuta loved his family too. Everything ended with a phone call. There were supposed to be two, one to Hizashi and one to Namuri. The two of them, however, had apparently decided to stay at the restaurant Izuku had left them in and spend the rest of the afternoon gossiping. At least they could carpool. He opened to the apartment door to meet two pairs of arched eyebrows. But about time. Shoyuta dragged them both forward and into the living room where the entire crew was sprawled along with copious amounts of paper, 3 laptops, 1 battered whiteboard, and more markers and pens than Shoyuta suspected he'd ever seen in his life. Izuku, with a cackling Nizu on his shoulder, turned away from the whiteboard and waved, pink marker uncapped in hand. Hizashi waved back. Everyone, Shoyuta started, this is Present Mike and Midnight. Present Mike and Midnight, this is Detective Tsukachi, his friend and All Might secretary, Yagi Tashinori, Midoriya Inko, Problem Child, and Problem Child's friends, Dabi and Toga. The teens all looked over, but Tsukachi and Yagi barely nodded. Tsukachi had lost his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and was emphatically gesturing that, the law doesn't work that way, you overgrown scarecrow, to a lopsidedly grinning Yagi. Shoyuta felt that he was maybe starting to understand that friendship, just a bit. Social niceties over, Shoyuta turned to his oldest friends. We have discovered that Endeavor is a deadbeat dad on top of being generally scummy, and Problem Child has a surprising amount of evidence that generally scummy actually translates to criminal negligence. At best, we're taking him down. I would like to volunteer to punch him in the face. Midnight immediately threw out. Toga giggled and Dabi sighed. Shoyuta was definitely keeping them, and not just because they kept making Izuku smile. No, he wasn't that sentimental. Please. I volunteered you for that 3 hours ago. He did, Inko confirmed, because she was lovely. It's such a pleasure to meet you both. I'm quite enjoying meeting my boy's friends, she continued, because she was evil. Shoyuta opened his mouth but was immediately shushed by a waving tea towel. You can protest the adoption when you can maintain a proper sleeping schedule with 3 meals a day. Liar, he told her. She laughed. Well, yes. But by the time you manage that, Izuku will have completed stage 9 of plan adoption and you'll never be free. Shuta's student was nodding in the background and Shoyuta couldn't quite decide whether he wanted to ask what stage they were currently at. He was at stage 5 of plan intern and would hate to be behind. I love you. So much, Hizashi breathed. Ah, Izuku was right, wasn't he? That was a coup. Inko was cooing at his best friend. Shoyuta was discombobulated. Told you, Mom. So right. Namuri confirmed, and Shoyuta had lost track of the conversations and was starting to get grumpy about. I'll get you both tea. It's a lovely jasmine blend Nizu brought the first time he came over for dinner. He wasn't actually invited, Shoyuta was sure to say before Namuri's scowl gained words. Because he hadn't been, though both Izuku and Inko had been thrilled regardless. And the point of your invitation are these two. Shoyuta gestured to Dabi and Toga, whom had been pulled upright by Izuku and led forward. One for you. Shoyuta directed Izuku to place Toga in front of Namuri. And one for you. Dabi stood in front of Hizashi on his own, running dark eyes over Hizashi's braids and colorful shirt. Oh, you can't just hand out kids? Hizashi's tone very much belied his words. He totally believed Shoyuta could and would. We don't mind. Toga said as she leaned forward with hands tucked behind her back. You're pretty. Shoyuta was pretty sure that was directed to Namuri, but who knew? Zashi's braids were kind of pretty. I mind. Dabi added placidly. Tough. Shoyuta patted the boy on the shoulder, once, as Izuku leaned into the kid's side. They'll be joining 1R and the dorms as soon as we can get them ready and push the final approvals through the board, but they need somewhere to stay. There's going to be a sleepover tonight, and wow, Shoyuta didn't know Izuku's eyes could get that bright. But that might not work out long term. Particularly if things slide in the direction of requiring official protection, and they might. So introductions and such. Get used to each other. Talk and all that shit. If you get along, you can be a viable backup plan. He was met with 4 blank stares, Izuku having apparently been the only one to expect this when Shoyuta had said he was calling Hizashi and Namuri over, another reason why Izuku was his favorite. What? He has a destructive quirk and she's overrun by society's image. You two relate and I trust you. Besides, they need somewhere to stay and my hands are full with the problem child, developing a new form of education, fallout for destroying a school, and dragging the number 2 hero into the abyss. And even without the potential danger, I'm sure as hell not letting the foster system get their hands on 2 kids with troubled pasts and villainous quirks. There was a long silence that allowed Shoyuta plenty of time to really reflect on his words. He still agreed with them, but he also saw the trouble he'd let himself into. He confirmed said trouble when he turned around from his friends and the teens to see the rest of the room looking at him. Inko was looking at him. Izuku was looking at Nizu. Nizu was looking back at Izuku, paws pressed together. Tsukachi had pressed his face into the couch. Yagi had apparently embraced the chaos and wasn't quite as useless as Shoyuta had feared, because he was looking at the kids with a soft, understanding expression on his face. Shoyuta took a breath, felt it move through his body and settle like a lattice of iron across his skin, and lunged for his problem child. The brat danced away, already switching his marker for a pen. No, absolutely not. We're starting with reforming the educational system and escalating with ruining a rather famous hero. The foster system can be penciled in for later. No, problem child, do not reach for that notebook. I will hide all your blank ones, don't doubt me. Shoyuta ignored Toga asking Namuri if she'd ever stabbed someone and Hizashi complimenting Dabi's coat. Shoyuta stepped around Inko offering Yagi more tea and the man's properly honored expression. Izuku maintained distance by jumping over the pretending to sleep detective and the principal sitting on the man's back. Shoyuta still caught Izuku, because Shoyuta was his teacher and the kid still had lots to learn, and the kid, breathless with laughter, ideas pouring from his lips, begged for just 1 page. Just a few ideas. Please sense. Shoyuta smiled back because he couldn't help it. The smile was Izuku's, sun-soaked edges soft and lingering. Everything started with an email. The email wasn't Izuku's. Not officially. Not in any way that could be tracked to him, digitally or otherwise. The email was mean. Not cruel, but definitely mean. The first paragraph read like a complaint, full of general statements of anger and outrage and disbelief in Endeavor's right to be a hero. The second, third, and fourth paragraphs had to be deleted before the email was ever sent. Well, the fourth one was only a couple lines, but Izuku had finally caught himself explaining all the reasons why Endeavor was a shitty hero and repeatedly hit the backspace key. This was not the right medium for that. The revised second, third, fourth paragraphs were frankly cathartic. They were straight-up analysis and application of said analysis. Izuku could do that in his sleep. Had, on occasion. Not that he did this analysis while asleep. No, this analysis got 100% of his focus. Izuku started by dissecting Endeavor's quirk. He proceeded to outline the way several other quirks would effectively combat Endeavor's quirk. Then he went on to break down Endeavor's fighting style, which, while admittedly effective in straight combat, was basically different manifestations of brute force and thus susceptible to several clever strategies. And some not so clever ones, to be honest. Izuku finished by moving on to Endeavor's position in group efforts, which were frankly abysmal. He would have left group efforts out entirely, except Izuku figured this was an excellent time to branch into Endeavor's agency. He stopped just short of attaching a full battle plan detailing the top 3 ways to tear Endeavor's agency to the ground through martial force. Honestly, the main reason he stopped short was that Aizawa-sensei hadn't gotten to battle plans yet and Izuku had very little practical experience in a fight. He could spot holes and advantages better than many pros, so said Aizawa-sensei, Yamada, Nemuri, and Nizu-sensei at least. And they couldn't all be wrong. But Izuku didn't want his work to be sloppy. For that same reason Izuku also got Aizawa-sensei to proofread the email. Aizawa just grinned after reading the email, while Yamada, reading over the man's shoulder, gave a low whistle, and Izuku thought it adorable how Yamada was too busy being delighted and Aizawa was too busy being comfy to notice how very deliberate Izuku's and his mother's invitations to the blonde man actually were. I see now why you were worried about the kid becoming a villain, Yamada said. Izuku blinked. You were worried about me becoming a villain? Aizawa-sensei waved a hand, momentarily off-balancing the laptop across his legs. More worried about the situation driving Deku to extremes, but yes. Izuku tilted his head. Are you still worried? Yamada snorted, but Aizawa didn't look up from where he actually was adjusting some of the grammar and wording of the email. Only that you won't give me enough heads up. Yamada and Izuku exchanged a look, marginally relieved to find the other equally confused. Show. Yamada poked Aizawa in the cheek. Aizawa sighed but did look up. Yes. You want me to warn you if I decided to go villain? Izuku asked. Because that sounded like a poor choice if he ever did make that decision. Not that Izuku would. But it would be bad planning to give one of the people with the best chances of stopping him a heads up. Aizawa-sensei stared straight at Izuku, one eyebrow raised over deep black eyes. Yes, problem child, I want at least 3 weeks warning. If you go villain now, I know you well enough to understand it's either part of a plan, under coercion, or we're taking down hero society as a whole. He went to look down again, but stopped at Izuku's tiny little, we problem child. What? You think I'd let you get into that level of nonsense alone? The email eventually got edited, but only after a round of hugs and tears and possibly some laughing. Yamada eventually got pulled into the octopus arms, so he wasn't laughing long. There wasn't an eventually after the email was sent. Endeavor's agency reacted immediately. Within the hour the entire building had gone on lockdown. Civilian access was restricted, public interaction was limited, and any and all heroes associated with the agency were paranoid and angry. Which was making the public suspicious and angry. Izuku leaned away from his laptop and took a long sip at his coffee, not even wincing at the cold bitterness that seeped over his tongue. His eyes quickly tracked back to the screen as comments kept being added to the Hero Forum. He'd been doing a sweep over several forums, groups, support pages, and social media sites all morning. Endeavor and his agency were a hot topic. The changes hadn't gone unnoticed. Some people were praising the increase in violence in his takedowns, seeing it as a crackdown on trouble, but most were uncomfortable. Taken with the increased difficulty of reporting crimes to the agency and the increased vetting of civilians who persevered, well, things escalated. The stories popping up on all sort of hero forums didn't help. For example, Izuku was staring at an account of a woman who had tried to walk into the agency and provide evidence for a case as per prearranged appointment, only to be told she had to stand in line for over an hour to make it through new security procedures. When she complained, she was forcibly ejected from the premises. The woman was 66. It only took Izuku a few comments and strategic reroutes here and there to spread that woman's story, among others, more effectively. Honestly, he was barely even needed. The outcry kept worsening and the ranting kept increasing mostly on its own. A plate was thunked down across from him and Izuku dragged his attention up to meet Dabi's gaze as he plunked down at the table Izuku had commandeered in a coffee shop just barely within sight of Endeavor Agency. "Yo, Green Bean." "Dabi." Izuku smiled as he watched the older boy start tearing pieces off his muffin and slowly eating it. "Your muffin is green." "Sure is." Dabi ate another chunk. "Dabi, why is your muffin bright green?" "It's pistachio. Pistachio makes things green." Izuku felt his smile grow even as he evaded a swatting hand to take a chunk for his own. He hummed at the taste. "That's really good." "Course it is. Why else would I get it?" Izuku let the very obvious answer lie and went in a different direction entirely. "You look good." Because he did. Dabi still had his original long black coat, but it had been washed and patched, with a few extra pockets sewn in. Izuku couldn't see a shirt beneath the jacket, but the pants were hole-free and tucked neatly into serviceable but new combat boots. He also wore fingerless gloves that Izuku didn't imagine would hold up great to his quirk without some reinforcement, but covered up the edges of his scars on his wrists and palms quite nicely. Dabi shifted in his seat. Yeah. Hizashi and Namuri took Toga and I out shopping. Toga loved it. Namuri might have gone a bit wild. Izuku fought back a smirk, knowing that Toga loving it was probably the key factor to the entire experience. The expression fell when he took in Dabi's fingers tapping the edge of the table and the way he wouldn't quite look at Izuku. "It's not free, you know," Izuku said quietly. Dabi jerked his head up and Izuku leaned over the table before continuing. "I mean, I get the sense that Namuri probably went a little overboard and might have used her own funds, but that just seems like her personality. Otherwise, UA and the commission are funding your keep and they expect you to work for it. Not in like a forced work kind of way, but in a sweat your butt off to complete the program kind of way. I can show you the breakdown of the finances later, if you want." Dabi blinked at him, before giving a chuckle that resembled gargled gravel and running a hand through his hair. "But don't like charity. I get waiting for the other shoe to drop and the creeping terror of owing someone something somehow. Bullies always felt they were owed something while those in power tended to keep meticulous records of everyone else's debts. But it's not charity. You pay it back. Zukadash. You pay it back by being a hero. By graduating and helping people in turn." Dabi looked at Izuku, then over to the 3 empty coffee cups and lowly whining computer. He reached out and ran a hand through Izuku's curls, the glove pulling roughly but still letting warmth sink into Izuku's scalp. "Okay, Green Bean. Okay." Izuku beamed, and Dabi shook his head while retracting his hand. "So I heard a rumor that Endeavor Agency has had a rough week. Something about a recent threat, I believe the press conference said." Izuku snorted and turned back to his computer, flicking over to another site to see if anyone had managed to calm the thread down. "You can't believe everything you hear. Besides, I heard that it wasn't a threat at all. A list of deficiencies is simply a list if no plan of action is included or follow-up stated. And a list isn't legally a threat. Maybe the insinuations that this list could be sent to others was a threat, but that insinuation was really only made by the list's existence in the first place. And the conclusion that Endeavor and his agency had made about the reasons such a list was created at all. It certainly wouldn't make much sense for a list of weaknesses to be sent to owner of said weaknesses without plans for follow-through. Unless the sender wanted to sow some chaos, cause a distraction, and install the kind of paranoia that led to mistakes. Or was an independent consultant that routinely tried to help heroes improve. But really, how likely were either of those options? A taunt and an incoming attack were surely much more plausible. Right? "Those computer lessons treating you well then?" Dabi asked as he eyed the laptop as one might a venomous snake. Izuku smiled, fully knowing that there was likely a bit of Nizu bleeding into the edges of a grin he'd stolen from Aizawa-sensei. Oh, very much so. While Izuku was still very much a baby hacker primarily dabbling on public sites that had minimal security, his grand-sensei believed in education through example. Izuku had gotten a very thorough explanation on how the email would be untraceable and how Nizu had ensured that no computer or account would be spared in the efforts for everyone associated with Endeavor Agency to receive the email. Glad you're having fun. Dabi had finished his muffin. Izuku stared at the return of the tapping fingers of his friend. Are you ready for Phase 2? Izuku asked, voice as soft as whispers written on paper. Nope. Dabi stood up, chair legs screeching across the floor. Let's go anyways. Izuku quickly packed up his bag and brought his stack of cups to the front before following Dabi as he swept out the door. The computer bag thumped into his side with each step away from the agency. It only took about 10 steps for Dabi's arm to brush Izuku's 3 times, so Izuku linked their elbows and hung off Dabi much like Toga might. The older teen glared at him, but the heat was all in his arm which left none for his gaze. Izuku cozied up, warmth seeping into still fingers. He was ready, he was happy. Everything escalated with a present. Well, several presents. Several presents to several different people. Because why mess with something that worked? They started with flowers for Rei. All sorts of different flowers. The flowers didn't mean anything, exactly, though Dabi had gone a little red in the face when he mumbled something about picking wildflowers and destroying the occasional garden in his younger efforts to make his mom smile. The notes were tucked in the colorful vases, sealed in waterproof bags pressed tight to the edges. It had only taken 3 exchanges for Dabi to take the place of Izuku as the flower delivery service. Shoyuda knew that more flowers had been sent to the Todoroki residence, but Yamada and Inko had overseen that particular operation. Apparently, there had been a meeting held in one of the smaller conference rooms at the library that contained tears, thrown flowers, and some very clingy younger siblings. The rest of the presents were left to Shoyuda, Izuku, and Yagi. They were all being sent Deku style. Not completely Deku style, as there were no fancily colored wrapping paper or gift boxes, but that was deliberate. Shoyuda didn't want this connected to Deku or Izuku, not yet. Not this soon. Instead, there were plain boxes with appropriate labels. They would look at home in any agency evidence or mailroom. Which was the point? Shoyuda, Izuku, and Yagi had chosen their targets carefully, had chosen agencies and heroes that were good and solid and in the business for the right reasons. Still, it was one thing to open a box for evidence on a crime, and another to open a box for evidence on the number 2 hero's crimes. And there were a lot of crimes. Even ignoring the child abuse and neglect side of things, which Shoyuda had no intention of doing, there were a lot of crimes. Excessive force and negligence were the most frequent. Nizu had called Shoyuda to come grab Izuku for a break after a lesson on data aggregation where they'd spent the day mapping and charting the physical and structural damages of Endeavor's fights. The break involved ice cream. The lesson after the ice cream involved fitting those maps and charts into the outrage the public using social media phase. The heroes got summaries of cases they'd been on or been running, only to have Endeavor sweep in and take care of things. The heroes got testimonies of former villains, the kids, the poor, the ones from Izuku's notebooks, that were written from prison or hospitals or long-term care. The heroes got recordings, obtained in mysterious and not at all dubious ways, of Endeavor Agency admitting to seeing a fault in a building yet charging in always. Yagi was invaluable for the hero presence phase, as much as Shoyuda would never admit it. Not so much on the target chasing side of things. The full depth of Endeavor's cruelty had shaken the man more than Shoyuda expected. The suggestions Yagi put forth were few but solid, and even included several retired heroes with more influence than Shoyuda would have guessed. Yagi had turned in his paper of potential names to Shoyuda when Izuku was asleep leaning against Shachua's knee, the papers resting on the kid's stomach rising and falling with each of the kid's breaths. "It's not much, I know," Yagi had said with bruised eyes and the slightest tremble to skeletal hands. "But I'm certain of them on a personal level. They won't let Endeavor's name slow them down." There had been 2 things Shoyuda could have said to that. He went with personal level? The bruises shifted as Yagi met Shura's eye, and though there was no steam or increased musculature, Shoyuta felt the weight of the number one hero pressing down on them. I never liked Endeavor. Not from he start. He was too loud, too angry, too competitive. I never felt he wanted to be a hero for the right reasons. Yagi gave a shrug of sharp shoulder blades and sharper expectations. Shoyuta had never wanted to see the number one hero move with the thin angles of a scarecrow on puppet strings. I am, however, Yagi continued, smart enough to know that not all heroes are like me, that not all heroes have the same reasons. I trusted him, Eraserhead, as a professional hero. Endeavor was my colleague and I trusted him even as I didn't like him. This is not an excuse, as I seem to be saying far too often lately, but the kind of cruelty Endeavor practices, with its creeping edges and public face, is the kind I'm least equipped to handle. Yagi shook his head, long hair falling in front of his face, before turning to look at Izuku. Yagi sighed so deep he rattled. I should have noticed. I should have looked deeper. I would have tried to stop him if I'd seen. Shoyuta believed him. Shoyuta had always hated the number one hero and the symbol of peace. Had always seen the many ways that could come crashing down in a resounding fall of pride and vulnerability. But All Might was a good hero for all his faults. A hero with integrity. A hero with expectations and a role and a place. Shoyuta sighed, in turn, hand ghosting up to rest on Izuku's curls. You would have failed. Yagi blinked slowly before raising his head to once again meet Shura's eyes. Yes. I would have. He would have. All Might, for all his sidekicks and agency workers and team-ups, worked alone. Which was fang hard, Shoyuta knew from experience. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an apology and Shoyuta wasn't any more inclined to leave Izuku and Yagi alone for long PRDS of time. Shoyuta was smart enough, with the new evidence of the last few weeks, to re-evaluate. To admit he hadn't seen the man behind the hero, hadn't necessarily expected the man behind the hero to understand his own limitations, to have knowingly cast himself into the role, fully understanding not only the weight he'd have to bear, but also the cracks he'd likely never fully see. Shoyuta still didn't like the number one hero, but he could probably like Yagi, if the man continued to acknowledge his faults and didn't put his head back up his butt. He could also trust Yagi, again, not with Izuku, that would be earned, monitored, and granted only by unanimous vote consisting of him, Inko, and Tsukachi, if the last few weeks were anything to go by. Yagi was taking to the plan with a viscous intelligence and cheerful mischief. The former probably shouldn't surprise Shoyuta. You don't survive as the number one hero by brawn alone. The latter probably shouldn't please Shoyuta as much as it did. Hizashi had tried to leave the room once when he'd walked in only to find Shoyuta grinning, Izuku cackling, and Yagi smiling serenely. Tsukachi had shoved Hizashi back in with a sharp push to the shoulder blades, muttering something about not being left alone. Yagi also had a memory tighter than any prison Shoyuta had ever visited. He might not want to state his opinion about other heroes, but Yagi was happy to rattle off the complete story of their various takedowns and interactions at hero functions. Which was honestly quite helpful, when Izuku and Shoyuta were on the fence about someone or facing the wall created by Shura's complete lack of interest in hero politics. There was also the strategic advantage. Presents had to be delivered. While Izuku's network, and honestly what the the kids' network was large and functional and Shoyuta was so proud of the brat, was really quite useful, they also had to bring in some heroes with higher clearance or access levels. Since they were avoiding Deku's usual habit of trees and the like. Shoyuta was happy to use his underground coalition. Really, the people he worked with weren't actually surprised to be handed a box, told not to open it, and leave it without being noticed. Ms. Joke hadn't even laughed at him, just asked if it was training or a mission. Izuku had a couple of contacts as Deku, too. A young hero named Bubble Girl was particularly eager after learning they were trying to take down a corrupt hero. Apparently she'd had some bad experiences, and Izuku seemed quite happy to have another friend to text. Yagi as All Might had visited a truly excessive number of agencies. The memory thing came into particular advantage here. He'd once overheard Izuku and Shoyuta debating on bringing in Nizu for getting into Best Jeanist's agency, since they man had truly great security. With extreme casualness, Yagi had borrowed one of Izuku's notebooks, sketched out a remarkably complete floor plan in less than 10 minutes, and added the regular meal times for the main players and service staff. At the bemused stares of his new allies, Yagi had just shrugged. I like to be prepared. At least 40% of their presents had been delivered by Yagi too, since the man had a built-in disguise and enjoyed walking into other places completely unrecognized with the great glee of a repressed sheet disturber. So Shoyuta was maybe starting to like the man. Which was annoying but manageable. Yagi was still afraid enough of Shoyuta that Shoyuta figured it wouldn't even be hard to pressure the man into some child development classes. Maybe some teaching courses. Whatever would make Shoyuta more inclined to leave the hero alone with Shuta's kids. On the day that divorce and custody papers were sent off as the first physical present for Endeavor, Shoyuta came home, to Izuku's home, not Shuta's, no matter the fact that Izuku and Yamada had catnapped Shuta's 2 cats weeks ago, to the entire younger generation of Todorokis sitting around the table. Inko was with Rei and the lawyers, the two having bonded almost instantly. They and Nizu were ensuring that the kids didn't have to go back to Endeavor at all, helped by the fact that only Todoroki Shudo was young enough to need a legal guardian. Between the recently released Rei and her extensive mental and physical health plan, 2 older siblings absolutely willing to look after their brother, and Nizu wearing his Principal of UA hat, Shoyuta wasn't worried about the part of the plan's success. The kids, however? That worry seemed to currently be buried under a surprisingly amount of respect and bemused or vicious glee, depending on the person. All 4 of the Todorokis, Toga, and Izuku were watching the TV with great focus. Were watching Endeavor blow the F up, in particular. He hadn't even gotten wind of the custody cases, Shoyuta didn't think. No, he was ranting and raving on national TV about the other heroes stealing his cases. Which even the reporters normally on his side for press conferences seemed to have some trouble believing. Weren't heroes supposed to work together to protect people, after all? Todoroki Natsuo, head tilted and one hand clenched in Dabi's sleeve, looked up at Shoyuta. You stole his cases? We stole his cases. Shoyuta agreed. That had been part 2 of the hero present phase. First, give the other heroes evidence that Endeavor was crooked so they'd either investigate, refuse to take his side, or publicly dismiss him, then give them evidence to wrap up Endeavor's case and make the man mad. Mad men made mistakes, and Endeavor had a temper. Solved a bunch too. It wasn't even hard, Izuku added. Todoroki Fuyumi rubbed one of her arms absently. He's so upset. I don't think I've ever seen him this publicly angry. Well, Izuku stated, rounding out his words, we've been pushing him to the edge for a while. His agency is still expecting an attack and the other agencies are downright hostile due to all that malpractice evidence we've been shoving down their throats. And public opinion has been taking a dive so steep that he's feeling it in the merchandise and financial quarters. Now we've attacked him at what matters to him most, his competency, otherwise known as his arrogant pride in his own ability to be a hero. He needs someone to blame, and the other agencies are prime targets. They won't be for long, but he's still got some time to completely alienate them. All eyes were on Izuku, who only smiled blithely back. We have some time before the personal side of things comes out with the divorce and custody matters, which is also when All Might gets to publicly denounce Endeavor as a hero entirely. Any last requests? Todoroki Shudo looked up from his hot chocolate, fingers flexing around the mug. His voice was slightly hoarse, as if this was his first time speaking in a while. He doesn't like water. Izuku titled his head and let out a low hum. Shoyuta did the same, before grinning. I got this one, Zuku. He ran his hand through Izuku's curls and grabbed a handful of cookies from the plate because they were Inko's and thus delicious and he wasn't going to be sitting down for a while. He then pulled out his phone and called Namuri. While the phone rang, he gestured to a sharply grinning Toga. Come on, Tiny Terror, you're going to like this. Shoyuta couldn't be completely upstaged by his own student, after all. Shoyuta returned later that afternoon with a smug smile on his face and an official UA packet under one arm. A present he might be willing to call it, though only because of his good mood. The news was still on as he stepped into the apartment, though a moment's attention had him realizing it was a recording put on loop. The loop started much where the show from the morning had, with Endeavor ranting. Except he wasn't ranting at the screen, he was ranting under his breath at his sidekick as the two ran down the street, and the video camera just happened to have a very good microphone. Izuku had been happy to introduce some of his network to Shoyuta, who'd been just as happy to outfit them with some real equipment and a paid criminal informant gig. A bare minute in and the camera shifted to show a newbie hero, Mount Lady, and Midnight patrolling across the road. Mount Lady had been happy to have Midnight tag along for the chance to ask the older woman some questions and the possibility to punch Endeavor in the face. A minute after that, and the screen caught the blurry image of a young woman in a hoodie, jumping over a bench or running in and out of frame. Toga had been happy to play bait, even before Shoyuta promised to be on the rooftops and ready to cancel the F out of Endeavor's quirk if anything went even the lightest bit wrong. Toga ducked behind the two female heroes, hands grasping the back of Midnight's uniform even as Mount Lady gave a visible jump. Mount Lady pulled herself together very quickly, however, particularly when Endeavor and his sidekick raced up and halted less than a foot away. From their faces, the two women refused to hand over the concealed Toga to a emphatically gesturing Endeavor, which was completely fair because Toga actually hadn't done anything besides run past Endeavor at full speed while cackling maniacally. Endeavor's paranoia, shitty personality, and rough few weeks had done the rest. Then Endeavor made a critical mistake. He called all female heroes soft-hearted, insulted their ability to be level-headed, and disparaged their combat readiness. He followed up his words by bullying his way past Midnight and Mount Lady to reach for Toga. Toga, in a move that surprised no one who knew her, stabbed him in the arm in what Shoyuta would swear as a witness was a perfect example of fear-induced self-defense. Midnight, in a move that surprised no one who knew her, punched him in the nose so hard he stumbled a good few feet back. This wouldn't have been a problem, exactly, except Mount Lady had stuck out a rather large foot, obviously because she was off balance from Endeavor's shove, and the number 2 hero had fallen backwards. And down a short but steep slope into the river. While his female sidekick made a very slow motion to try and save him, before shrugging and saying oops, loud enough for the camera to pick up over Endeavor's yells. The footage was then sent to every media center in the city, and several beyond the city's borders. Toga was bought an ice cream cone for her trauma. The female sidekick had an interview at both Midnight's and Mount Lady's agencies scheduled for the next day. Izuku was grinning wildly at Shoyuta as the footage began to loop again, and Shoyuta absently wondered when a teenager being proud of him was Shuta's greatest marker of success. Todoroki Shuto looked a little more awed than proud, though the expression quickly shifted to confusion when Shoyuta dropped the UA packet present on the kid's lap. I picked up your acceptance to UA when I dropped Midnight off at UA. You're in 1A, which is my homeroom. You're officially mine now. And we look after our own. Izuku crowed. He then sat up perfectly straight. Wait, 1A? You're in my class. We'll be together. I've never had a friend in my class before. He turned to look at the youngest Todoroki, who was blank-faced and clutching the still-wrapped acceptance with white-knuckled fingers. I mean, if you want to be? Not to presume we're friends, or dash. He was cut off when a scarred hand was lowered over his face. Calm down, Green Bean. Dabi patted Izuku's cheek as he spoke. Stop panicking and let baby bro deal with his own panic. Kid's not used to the idea of friends yet. Izuku turned wide and watering eyes up to Dabi, and Shoyuta could have laughed at the growing fear on Dabi's own face. The teen was weak to tears. Izuku's in particular. I didn't mean to make him panic. Dabi opened his mouth, but was cut off by Todoroki's quiet voice. I would like to be friends. I'm not sure how, though. Izuku. That's okay. Dabi and Toga are my first healthy friendships. We can figure it out together. Dabi laughed at his brother's slow nod. See? It's happy panic. Just don't take your friendship cues from Mr. Grumpy over there. Shoyuta contemplated flipping the teen off, but figured he was the adult and that was beneath him. At least as long as his students were in the room, which actually included Dabi since Shoyuda was slated to give his second-year ethics class to our first year as part of their alternative education. Damn it. Shoyuda decided to just ignore the older teen and continued his path across the room to retrieve his sleeping bag from under the Midoriya's couch. Stashing sleeping bags at your friend's place is perfectly acceptable behavior. Izuku gasped, hand pressed to his heart in a very dramatic motion. Friends, Aizawa-sensei? I thought we were family? Shoyuda was torn. On the one hand, Izuku had just called him family, which maybe warmed Shuda's bones like someone had swapped his marrow for coffee. On the other hand, Izuku was only showing the slightest vulnerability, and it was almost completely overshadowed by the contented mischief that shone out of deliberately wide eyes. Sleeping bag pooling out of his arms, Shoyuda glared at his intern. You're being a manipulative little gremlin. I know you learned those eyes from Hizashi, don't think I don't. I will not cave. Shoyuda caved. Shoyuda woke up several hours later, sprawled on top of the couch in a darkened room with the TV playing the end credits to an All Might movie. There was a cat on his stomach, and he could hear the soft voices of Dabi and his brother from where they sat at the floor by the other end of the couch over the quiet music. Dabi's arm was raised along the seat of the couch so he could drape it along his brother's shoulders, which also tucked Dabi's arm against Shuda's shin in a warm line. Izuku was tucked against the arm of the couch, deeply asleep with one hand still in Shuda's hair, a warm presence in the many tiny braids the hero could feel tugging gently at his scalp. Shoyuda closed his eyes and buried his face into one of the blankets Inko had draped over them all. It was a happy panic. Everything ended with an essay. Izuku was very proud of his essay. So was Aizawa. Nizu had rarely seen Aizawa so proud of anything. Aizawa had read it once, read most of it aloud to Nizu even though Nizu had been emailed in his own copy, and then retrieved his phone so he could send copies to Hizashi and Namuri. It had taken very little prompting to get Shoyuda to take a night off in order to bring his intern out for dinner, dessert, and a tour of the best hidden support item workshops in the city. Nizu was also proud of Izuku's essay. The words were beautifully crafted and the arguments backed up and cited and presented neatly in attached appendices of graphs, statistics, and commentary. The public had latched onto the essay with the desperation of people who'd been wronged and betrayed. They shared and commented and tossed parts of the essay back and forth, working each other into a fervor of anger and angst and justice. The media had focused on the essay with the greed of people trying to monetize a crashing train or sinking ship. They knew Endeavor was going down and wanted to take their pieces as he went. The essay was a summary, a starting point, a treat large enough that there were enough angles to go around. The hero community had flitted about the essay with the discomfort of people who'd been poisoned and tainted. Endeavor had been one of their own, and while many were happy to have concrete reasons to hold against a hero they'd already disliked, many more hadn't seen it coming at all. The smart heroes, the cautious ones, also turned eye towards evaluating their own operations. Izuku hadn't seen that last particular result coming, Nizu was sure, though Shoyuda had. It was more a function of self-esteem that Izuku didn't quite see that his work would impact the rest of the heroes, that there would be a wide-scale cleanup process. Sure, some of the process would include attempts at burying evidence of wrongdoing, but that could be monitored. And the results of the essay and summary phase were Izuku's work. Nizu and Shoyuda had provided some extra resources, checked some calculations, passed along a few observations. The essay, though, Deku's essay, had been the boy's own analysis collated his own way. Nizu and Shoyuda had both insisted that Izuku sign the essay as Deku, as the consultant who already had a name in the hero community. They told him it would lend credibility, which it would. They didn't tell him it would build his credibility, which it absolutely would. Shoyuda and Nizu agreed that Izuku needed a name and a reputation and that the kid had already set the blocks up for that beautifully, even if Izuku didn't quite see that part of the picture with the correct scope. Even if Izuku was having a hard time making the mental jump from being perceived as a consultant to that of a hero. Consulting was the start. Interning was the jumping point. 1R was the base. Endeavor was the point of no return. These were Izuku's accomplishments. Things that the boy deserved to take credit for creating. Things that Nizu, Shoyuta, Hizashi, Nemuri, Tsukachi, Ectoplasm, Hound Dog, and many others could, when the time was right, point out with pride and say, look what work this hero has already done. And it was his work, for all that he had help, was learning to ask for help. Izuku had been clear about how he wanted this most recent accomplishment to go. Clear about wanting every bit of evidence to be true and real. There had been acres of unfellable forests in his eyes when Izuku had told Nizu that this takedown would be honest, that he wanted to learn the tricks and manipulations that might one day be needed to take down a villain or another corrupt hero, but this one had left them enough that it would be a shame to be anything else. Nizu hadn't even offered those lessons, yet. Shoyuta had picked very well indeed. Nizu complied with the boy's wish easily, definitely plotting those lessons for a later date, but happy to let his grand student lead this attack. Nizu's own folder on Endeavor hadn't been nearly as comprehensive as it should have been, regardless, considering Endeavor had been one of his students, once upon a time. Nizu understood, as very few could, that he couldn't control everything, that there were always failures, but that didn't make them less aggravating. His new grand student was a bomb, though, a bomb of cleverness, intelligence, and warm tea. And excellent timing. Shoyuta was aware of Nizu's plans for the commission, for weeding out the corrupt and the lazy there, but perhaps it was time fill the man in with greater detail. Endeavor's fall and one are provided several unforeseen opportunities in the grand scheme of things, after all. Izuku wasn't quite ready for that level of political danger, and Nizu wouldn't take the choice of whether to bring the boy into the commission situation away from Shoyuta, but there were still elements where either of their contribution would be welcome. All Might be a good starting place. The extent of that man's current involvement was quite the surprise to Nizu, and one that boded well for the coming year, particularly considering the search for All Might's successor and the hero coming to teach at UA. Maybe Nizu could get Yagi to shadow Shoyuta a bit. Surely that wouldn't end in bloodshed if they were already used to working together? Izuku would surely keep them both in line. Nizu looked over to where Aizawa and Izuku were crashed out on the couch of his office. The purple, soft couch that still looked like new because almost no one ever dared to sit on it. They were playing chess on Nizu's board, keeping Nizu company as he waited for the call from the commission stating that Endeavor had been removed from Japan's hero lineup, and might Nizu want to comment or record an official statement of support on behalf of UA. Or the one from the police stating that Endeavor was facing official charges, and might Nizu have any information to offer or possibly want to consult. Nizu paused in his paperwork at the sound of Shuta's soft laugh. That was a sound Nizu heard rarely. A sound he'd once wondered if he would ever hear, when a scraggly, bitter teen was sitting in his office after waging a remarkably effective war of attrition against half of the hero class in his year with nothing but a handful of untraceable pranks and in-class exercises. Of course, Nizu could have proven the culprit, but he was rather more impressed with the results of that war. He might have thought the results an accidental result, as most of Nizu's colleagues at the time had believed, except Nizu had seen Aizawa's expression. Nizu had watched, unfortunately through a camera lens, the barest flicker of rage when classmates had called Aizawa a villain for his quirk and Yamada a liability. Nizu had watched closely and in person the faintest trace of satisfaction when Aizawa sat through the class lecture on quirkism, discrimination, and UA's zero-tolerance policy. Nizu had taken the quirkiest behavior revealed in his own school rather seriously. A factor that the teenaged Shoyuta has absolutely predicted and utilized, since the evidence had been carefully left for Nizu himself, instead of being submitted through the usual procedures. Considering the several of the expulsions had been higher-level students part of said reporting procedure and at least 3 staff members had also been terminated, Nizu thought this a sound precaution. He'd clearly been too focused on outside plans and needed to refocus inward. It had taken weeks for the young Shoyuta to realize, or maybe simply to trust, that he wasn't in trouble. It had taken months for Shoyuta to grin, fanged and bright in Nizu's presence. It had taken years, as well as a graduation certificate and a demand for weekly teas, for Shoyuta to laugh, free and gleeful and maybe just a bit cynical. And now Shoyuta had a student of his own. One of many, technically, but the only one to trust and smile and laugh with, most certainly. Phase 67 of Plan, Student was turning out quite nicely, all told, and perhaps it was something Nizu shouldn't ignore, that both his student and his grandstudent had appeared just in time to bring light to something Nizu had missed. Nizu placed his pen down as the phone rang. He smiled with sharp teeth and lingering eyes, and neither of his humans flinched. Nizu smiled with creeping whiskers and soft paws, and both his humans smiled back. Nizu smiled as he answered the phone and was told that Endeavor had fallen, and hadn't Nizu been working on a reform class because that sounded like the most wonderful, wholesome idea to present to the media and the public. Nizu smiled because he did so love it when plans came together, particularly plans made with those with whom he could trust and smile and laugh. Nizu smiled because he was happy. There were more plans to make,